Hey there, tonight we're exploring the rich yet grueling world of a medieval Christmas feast. What you're about to discover is a sensory overload where your modern palate might surrender before the day is done. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. You're striding into a medieval banquet hall, and let me tell you, your 21st century sensibilities are in for a ride. Forget about your cozy Christmas dinner with turkey and stuffing. You're about to face a feast so extravagant, it makes a modern-day Thanksgiving look like a light snack. Step into the grand hall, and the first thing that hits you is the sheer cacophony of smells, some delightful, some downright bewildering. Welcome to the medieval feast, where boar's head, peacock, and all manner of exotic creatures take center stage. Let's talk turkey, but not literally, because turkeys didn't strut onto the European scene until after Columbus. Instead, in this medieval smorgasbord, you're likely to encounter a boar's head, an absolute showstopper crowned with an apple in its mouth. This wasn't just dinner, it was a spectacle. And if you're thinking this is just a quaint tradition, think again. The boar's head was a sign of prestige, not unlike today's truffle-infused whatever. It was the medieval equivalent of saying, yes, we can afford to serve a wild animal that tried to gore us in the forest. How's that for festive spirit? Now, let's get to the piece de resistance, the bird that's all show and no soul food, peacock. Yes, peacock, with its iridescent feathers, was served more for its visual appeal than its taste. Think of it as the medieval Instagram post, all about the likes, less about the substance. The bird was often cooked, then redressed in its feathers to appear as if it were still alive, a culinary catfish, if you will. And here's the kicker. The peacock was so tough and stringy, it'd make your modern rotisserie chicken seem like filet mignon. These meals weren't just about the food, though. No, it was about the sheer audacity of the display. But let's get real for a second. Could you, a modern diner accustomed to farm-to-table delicacies and organic everything, actually handle this feast? Fair warning, your stomach might stage a revolt. Medieval cooking methods were, shall we say, less than precise. Sauces were often concocted to mask the taste of meat that was past its prime, using spices like cinnamon and cloves, which were more common than your grandma's gingerbread cookies. The abundance of spices wasn't just for flavor. It was a status symbol, a flex of wealth and access, since these spices traveled thousands of miles along the Silk Road and could cost as much as gold. Now, before you start imagining an endless feast with plates constantly replenished, hold up. That's one of those romanticized myths we need to debunk. The reality was that food was precious, and even the wealthiest households had to budget. A grand manor could spend up to 50% of its annual income on food alone, not just for the holiday season, but all year round. Feeding a manor was no small feat. It required meticulous planning and a small army of servants to pull off. For context, an average medieval lord might spend about £20 a year on spices alone, roughly equivalent to $25,000 today. That's a lot of dough for a bit of flavor, but it was also a display of power and prestige. And let's not forget the logistics. Feeding everyone from the lord at the head of the table to the lowest servant required a staggering amount of resources. Picture this. A manor might need 1,000 pounds of beef, 300 gallons of ale, and 600 loaves of bread just for the Christmas feast. And that's just one evening's spread. It's not like they could pop down to the local supermarket, either. Everything had to be grown, raised, or hunted locally, stored in less than perfect conditions, and prepared without the modern conveniences we take for granted. Of course, this grand display of culinary prowess wasn't just about stuffing faces. It was a political and social event, a chance for the lord to show off his wealth and influence, to solidify alliances and assert dominance. The feast was an epicenter of power, where deals were made, marriages arranged, and occasionally enemies poisoned. Talk about a party with a side of danger. But here's where things get really interesting. While the upper crust was indulging in their boar's head and peacock, common folk were lucky to get a slice of humble pie, literally. Their meals consisted mostly of bread, pottage, and occasionally, if they were lucky, some salted meat. So, while the myth of the endless medieval banquet is enticing, it's clear that such opulence was reserved for the few, not the many. So there you have it, a glimpse into the wild world of a medieval Christmas feast. From the bewildering array of foods to the staggering logistics, it's a wonder any of it went down at all. And while the romantic allure of such grand occasions is undeniable, the gritty reality is far more complex. You might find yourself longing for the simplicity of a modern holiday dinner, less peacock, more mashed potatoes, and definitely fewer chances of being accidentally poisoned by your host. Now, before you get too comfortable with your idea of what a medieval Christmas feast looked like, let's pull back the velvet curtain on the social circus that was the seating arrangement. Imagine a Game of Thrones-style scramble for political positioning, only with fewer dragons and more turkey legs. At the top of the table, you'd find the Lord of the Manor, essentially the medieval equivalent of the CEO with a crown, or at least a really fancy hat. Sitting next to him would be his family, close allies, and high-ranking guests, all there to bask in the reflected glory of his wealth and power. But why did it matter where you sat? Because in a world without Instagram followers, your seat was your status symbol. The closer you were to the head of the table, the more important you were. This was not just about rubbing elbows with nobility. It was a political statement. Sitting next to the Lord could mean the difference between getting a plum estate or being sent off to manage a distant, damp plot of land where the only thing colder than the weather was the reception from the local peasants. As you moved down the hierarchy, you'd find knights, lesser nobles, and important guests, each with their own place in this social pecking order. For these folks, sitting close enough to catch the Lord's eye could result in favors, land grants, or even a marriage proposal. It's like medieval speed dating, but where the prize is a patch of arable land instead of a second date. Further down the table, and perhaps tucked into a corner, sat the local clergy, merchants, and any visiting dignitaries, their positions reflecting their own social standing and political importance. And then, of course, there were the servants and entertainers, crucial yet largely invisible unless summoned to perform or serve. This brings us to the entertainment of the evening, the jesters and minstrels who turned these feasts into the medieval version of a variety show. Jesters were the Netflix of their time, providing a mix of comedy, music, and let's be honest, some questionable juggling acts. These performers weren't just comic relief, they were the social glue, a way to keep the atmosphere light and mitigate any awkward political tensions that might arise from too many drinks and too many egos in one room. Imagine the pressure of trying to make a room full of tipsy nobles laugh, knowing that a single misstep could land you in the stocks or worse. Jesters had to tread a fine line, poking fun at the powerful without skewering them too hard. Minstrels, on the other hand, were the Spotify playlists of the era, providing background music and occasionally breaking into ballads that told tales of heroic deeds and epic romances. Their songs were the medieval version of sharing a viral video, captivating, memorable, and sometimes a little embellished. These performances weren't just entertainment. They were a way to reinforce social norms and values. Songs about the Lord's great deeds or the piety of the church could subtly remind everyone who was in charge and who held the moral high ground. But don't be fooled by the romantic notion of minstrels serenading a room of rapt listeners. The reality was often more chaotic. In a hall filled with clinking goblets and the chatter of hundreds of guests, these performers had to compete for attention, their voices rising above the din. Their presence was a reminder that the feast was as much about spectacle as it was about sustenance. Now, think about the logistics of pulling all this off. Coordinating a medieval feast was like producing a live-action drama, complete with a cast of hundreds and no rehearsal. The Lord's steward acted as the director, ensuring everything ran smoothly, from the roasting of the boar to the seating of squabbling nobles. Mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they could be politically disastrous. A poorly placed guest or a shortage of ale could lead to insults and grudges that lasted for generations. And here's another fun fact. Even the leftovers were a political statement. In a world where food scarcity was a constant threat, the ability to waste food was a flex of epic proportions. Uneaten delicacies were often distributed to the poor or the servants, showcasing the Lord's generosity, or at least his ability to pretend he cared about the less fortunate. So, as you recline in your comfortable 21st century chair, digest that for a moment. The medieval feast was a world where every bite, every laugh, and every seat was loaded with meaning. It was a dance of diplomacy and decadence, where power was paraded and alliances were forged over goblets of wine and plates of peacock. You might find yourself thankful for your casual dining room table, where the biggest controversy is who has to do the dishes. But wait, there's more. Just as you think you've got a handle on this medieval melee, let's delve into the darker side of these gatherings. Beyond the political maneuvering and the showy displays of wealth, there was always the looming threat of intrigue and betrayal. Feasts were notorious for being the stage where grudges were aired and vendettas enacted. Imagine sitting across from your sworn enemy, knowing that at any moment a cup of wine could be your last. It was a Game of Thrones played out with turkey legs and poisoned chalices. The stakes were high, and the consequences often deadly. But don't worry, dear listener, we'll save those tales of treachery and intrigue for another time. For now, let's just appreciate the medieval feast for what it was. A grand spectacle of human folly, ambition, and the never-ending quest for a better seat at the table. Stay tuned, because we've only just begun to peel back the layers of this decadent onion. Now, as the goblets clink and the peacock struts, well, metaphorically, since it's already been served, you might start to notice an unpleasant undercurrent beneath the perfumes and spices. Yep, we're taking a nosedive into the aromatic abyss of medieval hygiene, or the spectacular lack thereof. Welcome to the unfiltered reality of a feast where cleaning standards were as elusive as a unicorn at a joust. Let's start with the basics, or rather, the lack of them. In a time when bathtubs were more likely to be used for brewing beer than bathing bodies, cleanliness was a relative concept. The medieval approach to hygiene involved a lot of faith in both divine protection and the power of perfumes. Bathing was, at best, an annual event for many, and considered downright dangerous by others. They believed that water could open the pores and let disease seep into the body. So, instead of soap and water, the medieval crowd doused themselves in fragrances to mask the natural bouquet of living in an era without deodorant. How's that for a sensational nightmare? Picture yourself in the thick of this medieval melee, trying to enjoy your boar's head, while your neighbour's odor-unwashed peasant competes with the aroma of cinnamon-spiced meat. The hall, packed to the rafters with bodies, was a veritable petri dish of germs just waiting to ruin your holiday. And we haven't even touched on the more festive forms of medieval filth, like the delightful chamber parts tucked discreetly behind tapestries. It's enough to make you long for a clean, modern restroom, or at least a room with better ventilation. But wait, there's more, much more. Hygiene horror stories extend to the very food you're feasting on. Medieval chefs were culinary magicians, but not always the good kind. With no refrigeration, preserving food was a science built on salt and hope. Meat was salted, smoked, or pickled to delay spoilage, a process as imperfect as the medieval sense of humor. This is where spices came into play. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg weren't just there for flair. They were the medieval air fresheners, disguising the telltale tang of meat that had seen better days. The medieval spice trade was a booming business, with spice prices sometimes rivaling those of precious metals. Imagine coughing up what would now be thousands of dollars for a few pinches of pepper. Yep, that was the cost of keeping your roast boar palatable. But don't get it twisted. It wasn't just about masking the off flavors. Serving heavily spiced dishes was a sign of wealth and sophistication, a culinary flex that said, "I'm so rich, I can afford to eat meat that's past its prime with a side of expensive spices." Now, let's talk about the kitchen itself, if you dare to call it that. Picture a stone room with a roaring fire, massive cauldrons, and an army of cooks sweating over their creations. Add in a dash of chaos and a sprinkle of dirt, and you've got the recipe for your average medieval kitchen. And because health inspectors were as non-existent as unicorns, cross-contamination was as common as a jester's bad pun. It was a gastronomic gamble every time you took a bite. While the romanticized notion of a grand medieval banquet might conjure images of knights and ladies dining in luxury, the reality was more grimace than glamour. The allure of these feasts lies in the drama and spectacle, but the food safety standards, or lack thereof, could make your stomach churn faster than a knight's tournament. It's a wonder that more guests didn't end up as casualties of culinary misadventures rather than political intrigue. But in the grand scheme of medieval living, a bit of food poisoning was just another day at the office. Life expectancy was short, disease rampant, and survival often felt like a game of chance. They lived in a world where a cold could be catastrophic, and a feast was as much about seizing the day as it was about flaunting wealth. It was eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you might be felled by something as mundane as a spoiled pie. Yet despite the potential perils, these feasts were the social events of the season. They brought people together, for better or worse, in a shared experience that was as much about camaraderie as it was about consumption. In the flickering light of the grand hall, surrounded by the cacophony of laughter, music, and the occasional unseemly bodily function, you were reminded of the raw, unpolished edge of medieval life. It was messy and magnificent, a testament to humanity's enduring spirit in the face of less than ideal circumstances. So, as you sit in the comfort of your modern dining room, with its pristine table settings and hygienic food practices, take a moment to reflect on the medieval feast. It was a world where the senses were assaulted in the most glorious and grotesque ways, a place where life was lived large and fast, often outpacing the grim reaper himself. As you reach for another spoonful of mashed potatoes, be thankful that your biggest concern is whether the gravy has enough salt, not whether it's disguising something far less savory. And with that, dear listener, we leave the medieval banquet hall behind, but not without a newfound appreciation for the luxuries of modern life. Stay tuned, because we've still got plenty more medieval marvels and mishaps to unravel. Up next, we'll dive into the fascinating world of medieval entertainment, where jesters, minstrels, and the occasional bear-baiting session took center stage. It's a tale as tantalizing as it is terrifying, so stick around as we continue our journey through the tumultuous tapestry of history, and as we leave behind the medieval banquet hall and its sensory overload of sights, sounds, and smells. It's time to shift gears and peek into the purse strings of those extravagant feasts. Spoiler alert, medieval households weren't exactly rolling in doubloons. Hosting a grand feast was less about the joy of giving and more about the not-so-subtle art of flexing one's financial muscles. Imagine the scene. A medieval lord standing in his counting house, trying to justify the expense of a feast that could easily rival a modern wedding, with a guest list that included everyone from the highest nobility to the most obscure distant cousin. These feasts weren't just dinner parties. They were the medieval version of a corporate gala, designed to show off wealth, curry favor, and sometimes bury the hatchet, preferably not in one's back. Now about that cost. Pulling off a medieval feast was no small feat, pun absolutely intended. A typical large-scale feast could set a lord back as much as half of his annual income. We're talking upwards of £200 in medieval money, which is roughly $300,000 in today's currency. That's a lot of gold coins for a single night of merriment, and let's be honest, some questionable culinary choices. But why splash out so extravagantly? Well, in a time when social media was limited to word of mouth, and the occasional minstrel's ballad, a feast was the ultimate PR event. It was your chance to show the world, or at least your social circle, that you were a force to be reckoned with. The more lavish the spread, the more power you wielded. It was about prestige, influence, and ensuring your name was as well seasoned as your roast. These feasts also served as a vital economic engine for the surrounding community. Picture the scene. Local farmers, brewers, and craftsmen working overtime to provide the necessary provisions. A single feast could require thousands of pounds of meat, hundreds of gallons of ale, and enough bread to build a small carbohydrate fortress. The ripple effect on the local economy was significant, turning these events into economic lifelines for many. Now, let's talk logistics. Preparing for a feast of this magnitude wasn't a one-man show. It was more like a medieval Coachella, with an army of servants and workers laboring for weeks, if not months, in advance. Kitchens hummed with activity as cooks, bakers, and brewers toiled away, often working from dawn until the stars appeared. The labor force behind these events was staggering. Dozens of servants, cooks, and craftsmen, each playing their part in the grand production. It was an operation that required meticulous planning and a small army to execute. And what about the financial burden on the hosts themselves? Hosting a feast meant more than just showing off your culinary prowess. It was also a political maneuver. A well-executed feast could secure alliances, forge new connections, and even prevent uprisings. For a lord, the stakes were high. Botch the event, and it could mean social suicide, or worse, a loss of political power. It was a high-risk, high-reward scenario where failure simply wasn't an option. For all its spectacle and splendor, the medieval feast was a double-edged sword. While it showcased wealth and power, it also exposed vulnerabilities. A feast that went over budget could cripple a household financially, leading to debt, and in extreme cases, the loss of land or titles. It was a precarious balance of indulgence and restraint, where the goal was to dazzle without going broke. Yet despite these risks, the allure of the feast was undeniable. It was a chance to revel in the moment, to bask in the glory of one's achievements, and to remind everyone just who was in charge. So, the next time you're planning a dinner party, take a moment to appreciate your modest spread, and the fact that your reputation doesn't hinge on the quality of your appetizers. And there you have it, a glimpse into the economic underbelly of the medieval feast, a world where wealth was flaunted, power was paraded, and the stakes were as high as the peacock on the platter. As we continue our journey through the annals of history, remember that behind every grand gesture lies a web of complexity and intrigue, where the line between prosperity and ruin is as thin as a wafer and just as brittle. Stay tuned, because the medieval world is full of surprises, and we've only scratched the surface. Up next, we'll dive deeper into the mechanisms of medieval economics, exploring how these feasts impacted more than just the host's reputation. It's a tale of ambition, avarice, and the age-old pursuit of the good life, medieval style. While we've traversed the winding roads of medieval feasts, it's time to step back and take a hard look at the glittering myths that shroud these grand occasions. Medieval Christmas feasts are often wrapped in the twinkling lights of nostalgia, an imagined world where knights clinked goblets under the glow of candlelight and jesters juggled their way into our hearts. But peel back the layers, and you'll find a portrait that's less oil painting and more abstract art, a chaotic blend of harsh realities and whimsical fantasies. Let's start with the romanticized notion of endless bounty, a banquet table groaning under the weight of food. The reality, less all-you-can-eat buffet and more rationed indulgence. Sure, the table might have been laden with roasted meats and exotic spices, but for most guests, the feast was a rare brush with abundance in a life characterized by scarcity. A farmer in 14th century England, for instance, might earn only a few pounds a year, while a feast's boar's head could cost as much as a week's wages. The stark contrast between the glittering feasts of the elite and the meager meals of the peasantry was a reminder of medieval society's rigid hierarchy. This brings us to the heart of the matter, the role of these feasts in reinforcing the social order. In a world without social media influencers, lords and ladies used these gatherings to broadcast their power and wealth. It was a high-stakes game of social chess, where seating arrangements spoke volumes about one's standing. Sitting near the lord's table wasn't just a matter of enjoying the best cuts of meat. It was a public declaration of allegiance and influence. The closer you sat to the power brokers, the more likely you were to have your fortunes rise or fall on the whims of those above you. But let's not gloss over the sheer grit behind the glamour. The logistics of hosting such an event were nothing short of a medieval marathon. Picture the manor's kitchen, a sprawling, smoky hive of activity where cooks worked with the precision of a military operation. They had to prepare enough food to feed hundreds, manage the unpredictable whims of medieval ovens, and hope that the salted meat hadn't turned from aged to inedible. Now, let's talk ambience, or the medieval approximation thereof. Forget the gentle hum of conversation over soft music. These gatherings were a cacophony of clanging goblets, musicians trying to outplay the din, and the occasional brawl breaking out over a perceived slight. This wasn't Downton Abbey. It was more like a Renaissance fair on steroids. And don't even get me started on the hygiene factor. Remember, this was an era when bathing was optional and dental care was a fervent wish rather than a reality. It wasn't uncommon for the average medieval diner to have fewer teeth than fingers, and let's just say the breath mint industry hadn't quite taken off yet. The olfactory assault was all part of the medieval charm, or challenge, depending on your perspective. For all the pageantry, these feasts were a microcosm of medieval society, a reflection of its values and vices. They celebrated community and camaraderie, but also underscored the stark divides between the haves and the have-nots. The very structure of these feasts, with lords at the head and peasants on the periphery, mirrored the societal hierarchy. While the upper echelons feasted on peacock and boar, the lower classes subsisted on pottage and bread, a culinary reminder of their place in the grand scheme of things. Yet there's an undeniable allure to these feasts, a draw that transcends time. Perhaps it's the romantic notion of a simpler, albeit dirtier, time. Or maybe it's the human fascination with opulence and power, a longing to touch the grandeur of a bygone era. These feasts, with all their flaws and fantasies, continue to capture our imagination, offering a glimpse into a world where the lines between myth and reality blurred as easily as the wine flowed. As we savor, or perhaps stomach, these historical insights, it's worth pondering what they reveal about our own celebrations. Modern holiday gatherings, stripped of their medieval trappings, still echo the spirit of those ancient feasts. We gather with family and friends, share meals that, while less exotic, are no less meaningful, and create memories that bind us across time. In a way, understanding the reality behind the medieval feast adds a layer of appreciation for our own festivities. The next time you sit down to a holiday meal, perhaps you'll smile at the absence of roasted peacock or the assurance that your turkey was stored in a refrigerator rather than on a salted hook in a drafty larder. And when you raise your glass, you might just be toasting both the legacy of those medieval revelries and the simple joys of modern life. So, as we conclude our journey through the medieval banquet hall, remember that history, much like a good feast, is best savored with a pinch of salt and a healthy dose of curiosity. Let's carry forward these lessons, celebrating the spirit of togetherness and resilience that has transcended centuries. After all, whether it's a medieval manor or your own dining room, the heart of the feast remains the same, a celebration of life, love, and the ties that bind us all. World War II may conjure images of epic battles and iconic leaders, but lurking beneath this grand narrative was a seedy underbelly of sexual commerce that thrived like a weed in a war-torn garden. As armies clashed and countries crumbled, an illicit economy of desire prospered, fueled by desperation and opportunism. It's a tale as old as time. When chaos reigns, so does the black market, and in this case, it was all about the oldest profession in the world. Yes, folks, we're talking about the wartime sexual economy, where the currency of flesh was exchanged faster than you could say, ration coupon. Let's kick things off with a spotlight on comfort women, a term that sounds like it belongs in a self-help book, but actually hides a grim reality. Imagine being one of the estimated 200,000 women, primarily from Korea, China, and the Philippines, coerced or outright forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. These women were housed in what were euphemistically called comfort stations, a term designed to sanitize the brutality of their existence. The Japanese government at the time tried to sell these as voluntary arrangements for the women involved. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Survivors' testimonies paint a brutal picture of relentless exploitation and abuse, starkly contrasting with the official propaganda that depicted these sites as luxurious rest stops. Now, why would an otherwise disciplined military outfit engage in such practices? Well, it boils down to a mix of misguided morale boosts and a tragically flawed attempt at controlling rampant sexual assaults that plagued occupied territories. Providing soldiers with official brothels, they thought, would curb sexual violence. The irony is not lost on us. They essentially created a system where women were treated as supply lines for the troops' needs, a chilling commodification of human beings. Meanwhile, back on the home front and in the occupied regions, the black market for intimate encounters was booming. With traditional economic systems disrupted, people turned to alternative means of survival, and sex work, both consensual and coerced, became a significant component of this shadow economy. It's a classic case of supply and demand, albeit a deeply troubling one. In places like Paris, the liberation in 1944 didn't just bring freedom and celebration. It also brought American dollars, which found their way into the hands of those willing to offer companionship, or more, in return. This wasn't just an issue of moral decay, but a reflection of the desperate economic straits in which many found themselves. With the wartime economy strained and food and resources scarce, the black market filled the gaps. One could argue that it was a grim necessity for those trying to make ends meet in a world turned upside down. Money was tight, but a carton of American cigarettes or a tin of Spam could open doors to opportunity, or at least offer a temporary reprieve from poverty. But before we get too swept up in the grim carnival of wartime economics, let's not forget the role of propaganda in painting over these unsightly realities. Governments on all sides were masters of spin, and their propaganda machines worked overtime to churn out narratives of heroism and sacrifice. The gritty truths of wartime life, including the sexual economy, were scrubbed clean from public view. It's much easier to rally a nation behind the glory of conquest or the tragedy of loss than to confront the uncomfortable truths lurking in the shadows. Speaking of shadows, let's shed a little light on how governments, in their infinite wisdom, often chose to turn a blind eye. Sure, they were aware of what was happening. After all, they were often complicit in setting up systems that allowed these black markets to thrive, but officially acknowledging them risked tarnishing the noble veneer they were desperate to maintain. It's the classic case of see no evil, hear no evil, with a side of plausible deniability. Take the United States, for example. They were more than aware that GIs were engaging in these activities, yet chose to focus on maintaining troop morale rather than cracking down on the behavior. After all, nothing says support the troops like ignoring the fact that your soldiers are fueling a black market that exploits the vulnerable. The British, too, had their fair share of turning a blind eye, especially in regions where their colonial reach extended, prioritizing military objectives over moral policing. In the end, the wartime sexual economy was a complex web of survival, exploitation, and hypocrisy. It's a chapter of history not often illuminated in the textbooks, overshadowed by tales of heroism and sacrifice. But understanding it provides a more nuanced view of the human impact of war, not just the battles fought with bullets and bombs, but those waged in the quiet desperation of survival. As we continue to explore this unsettling aspect of World War II, let's remember that history is rarely as neat and tidy as the propaganda posters would have us believe. As we delve deeper into the murky waters of World War II clandestine operations, we encounter a chapter that reads like a spy novel with a steamy twist: sexual espionage. Yes, folks, welcome to the world of honeypot tactics, where seduction was a weapon and bedroom secrets could shift the tides of war. Forget James Bond with his shaken martinis. These were real-life agents using charm, allure, and sometimes a bit of pillow talk to gather critical intelligence. It was espionage with a sultry edge. Think less tuxedos and more lingerie. The concept of using intimacy as a strategic tool wasn't new, but World War II took it to a new level. Intelligence agencies on all sides realized that, when it came to extracting secrets, well-timed whisper in the dark could sometimes achieve what brute force could not. This led to the deployment of specially trained spies whose mission was to seduce and manipulate their targets, often under the cover of darkness, to gather vital information. These agents were the unsung heroes, or anti-heroes, of the intelligence game, using their wits and charm to outmaneuver enemy forces. One of the most infamous practitioners of this art was the Dutch dancer-turned-spy, Mara Hari. Although she met her demise before the war, her legendary exploits set the stage for a new generation of seductive spies. Her real name was Margaretha Gertruida Zell, and she became the poster child for the femme fatale stereotype. Mara Hari's story is a cautionary tale of glamour and deception, where the line between fact and fiction is as blurred as a foggy London night. While her espionage skills were debatable, she was accused and executed for allegedly causing the deaths of 50,000 soldiers. Her legend lives on as a testament to the power of allure in espionage. But World War II had its own cast of characters, each with their unique tales of intrigue. Take, for instance, the case of Christine Granville, a Polish-British agent whose exploits were nothing short of legendary. Known for her daring missions and remarkable ability to elicit information, Granville was awarded the George Medal and the French Croix de Guerre for her bravery. She once famously seduced a high-ranking Nazi officer, convincing him to release several of her captured comrades. Her charm was as potent as her courage, making her one of the most effective agents in the field. The economic context of these operations is fascinating. In an era where resources were stretched thin, intelligence agencies had to be creative, and sometimes that meant turning to unconventional methods. Training a seduction spy wasn't cheap. The cost of grooming, outfitting, and maintaining their cover could be substantial. But when weighed against the potential gains of critical military intelligence, it was an investment deemed worthwhile. Here, the currency was not measured in dollars, but in secrets and strategic advantages. It was all about the cost-benefit analysis in a high-stakes game where the stakes could mean the difference between victory and defeat. One particularly notable program was the Soviet Union's use of swallows and ravens, terms for female and male agents, respectively, trained in the art of seduction. These agents were often deployed to ensnare Western diplomats and military personnel, gathering intelligence that would be fed back to Moscow. It was a sophisticated operation, blending espionage with human psychology, exploiting vulnerabilities that were as old as time itself. And while it sounds like something out of a spy thriller, this was very much a reality, with real people playing dangerous games in the shadows of the Cold War. The allure of these stories lies in their tantalizing blend of romance and danger, a cocktail that's hard to resist. But the harsh reality is that many of these agents were operating in a world fraught with peril. A single misstep could lead to exposure, imprisonment, or worse. The romantic myth of the seductive spy often glosses over the personal sacrifices and the constant threat of being caught. It was a life lived on the edge, where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. Interestingly, these tactics weren't limited to women. Men, too, were deployed in such operations. In fact, the British Special Operations Executive, trained male agents in the art of seduction, recognizing that charm and charisma could be as effective as any weapon. These Romeo spies were tasked with targeting women in positions of influence, leveraging their relationships to gain access to sensitive information. It was a gender-inclusive approach to espionage, acknowledging that the power of persuasion knows no bounds. The political and social factors driving these operations were complex. In a world where traditional military strategies were often stymied by entrenched positions and fierce resistance, unconventional warfare offered a glimmer of hope. The ability to bypass enemy lines and gather intelligence through subterfuge and seduction was a tantalizing prospect for any war strategist. It was a testament to the ingenuity and resourcefulness that defined this era of conflict, where every option was on the table in the desperate bid for victory. As with any aspect of war, the reality of sexual espionage was far from the glamorous depictions we see in films and novels. It was a gritty, dangerous undertaking, fraught with moral ambiguities and ethical dilemmas. The agents who engaged in these operations were often operating under immense pressure, knowing that their actions could have far-reaching consequences. And while the allure of the spy life is undeniable, it's important to remember the human cost, the personal sacrifices made by those who walked this perilous path. So, as we pull back the curtain on this secretive world, let's keep our eyes open to both the legend and the truth. The romantic image of the seductive spy may capture the imagination, but it's the gritty reality that truly tells the story of World War II's shadowy underbelly. The next time you hear tales of dashing agents and their daring exploits, remember that beneath the surface lies a complex web of intrigue, deception, and survival. And as we continue our journey through this fascinating period, let's remain mindful of the lessons it offers, a reminder that history is often stranger and more complicated than fiction could ever be. Amidst the shadowy dance of espionage and intrigue, the world of World War II was also a stage for a different kind of performance, the shifting roles of women in uniform. As the war machine roared to life, women were called to serve in ways that society had never dared to imagine before. They donned uniforms, took up tools, and stepped into roles traditionally reserved for men, challenging the status quo with each buttoned-up jacket and polished boot. Let's talk numbers to get a sense of scale. By 1945, over 350,000 American women had joined the armed forces. In the UK, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, saw its ranks swell to over 180,000. Women were driving ambulances, piloting planes, and decoding enemy messages. And while Rosie, the riveter, was busy flexing her biceps on propaganda posters, Real-life women were welding aircraft and building ships. The war effort needed them, and they answered the call with grit and determination. But this wasn't just about patriotism and duty. For many women, the war offered a taste of independence that was as intoxicating as any victory celebration. With men off fighting, women found themselves filling roles that had been previously closed to them, both professionally and personally. They experienced a kind of sexual liberation, buoyed by the newfound freedom to earn their own money and make their own choices. The war, in its destructive fury, inadvertently cracked open the door to a new world of possibilities. Yet this wasn't a simple tale of empowerment and progress. Society, with its deeply ingrained gender norms, wasn't quite ready to relinquish its hold. While some women were praised for stepping into traditionally male roles, others were harshly criticized for stepping out of line. The hypocrisy of the era was as glaring as a searchlight on a dark night. Take, for example, the case of the Good Time Girls, a term that sounds like a 1940s pop band, but was, in reality, a label slapped onto women who dared to enjoy the social freedoms that wartime presented. These women faced harsh judgment and often vicious rumors. Being seen with a soldier, or even just enjoying a night out, could brand a woman as morally loose, regardless of her intentions. And then there were the women who faced even greater scrutiny. In occupied territories, relationships with enemy soldiers could result in brutal consequences. In France, the liberation brought with it a wave of retribution against women accused of collaboration horizontale. Thousands of women had their heads shaved in public shaming rituals, a stark reminder of the double standards at play. While men could fraternize with the enemy and be seen as strategic, women were labeled as traitors, their patriotism questioned. The economic context of this hypocrisy is fascinating. During the war, women's labor was not just welcomed, but desperately needed. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a cultural icon. She was a symbol of economic necessity. Women filled the gaps left by men, keeping factories humming and economies afloat. Yet, when the war ended, many were expected to return to their pre-war roles, as if their contributions were a mere blip in the historical radar. But here's the kicker. The war had changed things irrevocably. Women who had tasted independence and financial freedom were not eager to return to the confines of traditional domesticity. The seeds of the feminist movements of the 1960s and beyond were sown in the fertile soil of war-torn society. The economic and social shifts of the time created a new landscape, one in which women had proven their capability and resilience. And let's not forget the women who served as spies and saboteurs, their contributions often overshadowed by their male counterparts. The Special Operations Executive, so, recruited women for their unique abilities to blend in and gather intelligence. These women, like Violet Charbot and Noor Inayat Khan, operated behind enemy lines with courage that defied expectations. Their stories are a testament to the complex roles women played during the war, challenging the notion of what women could and should do. The political and social factors at play were a tangled web of contradictions. On one hand, the war necessitated a rethinking of gender roles. On the other, there was a strong desire to return to normalcy once the conflict ended. Governments and societies were caught in a tug-of-war between progress and tradition, with women often caught in the crossfire. In the United States, for example, the post-war period saw a concerted effort to encourage women to return to the home. The GI Bill provided opportunities for men to pursue education and careers, while women's wartime contributions were largely downplayed. Propaganda shifted from encouraging women to work to promoting the ideal of the happy homemaker. It was a stark reminder of the societal desire to return to pre-war gender norms, even as the reality of women's capabilities had been irrefutably demonstrated. But let's not paint too rosy a picture. Despite the advances made, the reality was that many women faced discrimination and inequality. Pay gaps persisted, and opportunities for advancement were limited. The war had opened doors, but it hadn't dismantled the barriers entirely. Women of color faced even greater challenges, contending with both gender and racial discrimination. As we look back on this era, it's clear that the war was a catalyst for change, but it was not a panacea. The rigid gender roles of the pre-war period were challenged, but they were not entirely dismantled. The war had illuminated the hypocrisy and double standards of the time, but it would take decades of struggle and activism to achieve meaningful progress. So, as we continue to explore the world of World War II, let's keep in mind the complexity of the human experience. It's a story of contradictions, of progress and setbacks, of liberation and repression. The war may have been a catalyst for change, but the journey towards gender equality was far from over. As we delve deeper into the stories of those who lived through this tumultuous time, let's remember that history is not a straight line, but a series of twists and turns that continue to shape our world today. In the cataclysmic chaos of World War II, while nations were busy redefining borders, some were also redrawing the boundaries of human decency. Enter the bizarre world of pseudoscientific racial theories, where Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan decided that conquering the world wasn't enough. They had to try playing God, too. These twisted ideologies shaped sexual policies that would make anyone's skin crawl. Let's take a deep dive into these dark waters, debunking myths and exposing grim realities along the way. First up, let's tackle Nazi Germany and its obsession with racial purity, a concept that sounds like it was dreamed up by a villain in a dystopian novel. The Nazis, led by the infamous Heinrich Himmler, took their racial purity campaigns straight out of a twisted fantasy. They were convinced that the Aryan race was superior and that it was their divine mission to keep this race pure. Spoiler alert, their methods were anything but divine. The Nazis instituted policies rooted in eugenics, a pseudoscience that was all the rage at the time. These policies led to the forced sterilization of around 400,000 people. That's almost the population of modern-day Miami, sterilized because they didn't fit the Aryan mold. They targeted anyone they considered genetically inferior, including those with disabilities, mental illnesses, or simply those who didn't fit their narrow definition of perfection. And speaking of twisted fantasies, let's not forget the Lebensborn program, a state-supported initiative that aimed to increase the Aryan population. Established in 1935, this program encouraged SS officers to father as many racially pure children as possible, often with women selected for their Aryan features. These children were seen as the future of the Reich, a chilling reminder of the Nazis' obsession with creating a master race. It was like a dystopian dating service, minus the romance, and with a whole lot more state control. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Imperial Japan was cooking up its own racial theories. The Japanese believed in their own version of racial superiority, viewing themselves as the rightful leaders of Asia. This belief was weaponized in their expansionist policies, which included horrific acts like the Nanking Massacre and the use of comfort women, a euphemism that does little to convey the horrors faced by those forced into sexual slavery. Japan's racial policies were driven by the concept of Hakko Ikkyu, roughly translating to 8 corners of the world under one roof. It was a vision of Japanese dominance, where they saw themselves as the patriarch of Asia. This belief in their racial superiority justified their brutal occupation of neighboring countries, where they sought to impose their culture and values, often through oppressive and violent means. In both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, these racial theories weren't just idle musings of a few madmen. They were institutionalized policies, deeply embedded in the state apparatus, and relentlessly pursued with chilling efficiency. The economic context here is telling. Both regimes used these theories as a justification for expansion and conquest, framing their imperial ambitions as a civilizational mission. It wasn't just about territory. It was about remaking the world in their own image, using pseudoscience as a flimsy pretext. But let's not kid ourselves. These theories were far from the romantic visions of cultural superiority they claimed to be. They were brutal, dehumanizing, and fundamentally flawed. The so-called science behind them was often laughably shoddy, cherry-picking data, and ignoring inconvenient truths. Yet they were sold to the public with slick propaganda that made them seem as inevitable as gravity. The impact of these racial theories was felt far and wide, leaving scars that persist to this day. In Germany, the legacy of the Holocaust and the eugenics programs forced a national reckoning with the past. Post-war, the Nuremberg trials laid bare the horrors of the Nazi regime, with the forced sterilization programs and racial policies receiving widespread condemnation. The trials were a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ideology, where pseudoscience became a state-sponsored nightmare. In Japan, the post-war period saw a different kind of reckoning. While the country faced international condemnation for its wartime atrocities, the issue of comfort women remains a contentious topic. The Japanese government's reluctance to fully acknowledge and atone for these actions has led to strained relations with neighboring countries, particularly South Korea and China. It's a painful reminder of the long-lasting impact that these racial theories and policies can have, shaping geopolitics long after the war itself ended. As we sift through the ashes of these dark chapters, it's clear that the allure of racial superiority was a siren song with a deadly pull. It promised a utopia built on the bones of the unfit, a world where science was twisted to serve the whims of ideology. The reality, however, was a dystopian nightmare, where human life was reduced to a series of cold calculations and heartless policies. So, as we continue to unravel the tangled web of World War II legacy, let's remember the human cost of these grandiose visions. The myths of racial purity, sold with all the slickness of a Hollywood blockbuster, were nothing more than a facade for some of the most heinous acts in human history. And though these myths have been debunked, the scars they left serve as a chilling reminder of the depth to which humanity can sink when ideology takes precedence over empathy. In this exploration of history's darker corners, we find that the past is never truly past. The echoes of these racial theories continue to reverberate, reminding us of the dangers of dehumanization and the seductive power of a simple, albeit false, narrative. As we move forward in our journey through World War II shadowy alleys, let's carry with us the lessons of caution and the necessity of questioning the stories we are told. History is complex, multifaceted, and above all, a teacher that demands we listen. As we continue this journey through history's underbelly, it's crucial to consider how these wartime practices left their indelible mark on the decades that followed. The legacy of World War II, sexual economy, and twisted ideologies didn't just vanish with the fall of Berlin or the signing of peace treaties. Instead, they seeped into the post-war world, influencing societal norms and political strategies in ways that still ripple through our modern era. Let's start with the Cold War, a period where the world seemed to have replaced one form of conflict with another. The superpowers were no longer exchanging gunfire, but were engaged in a different kind of warfare, one of ideology and influence. And surprise, surprise, the sexual espionage tactics honed during World War II found new life in this shadowy arena. The KGB, CIA, and MI6 all took a page, if not an entire chapter, from the World War II playbook, deploying agents who wielded seduction like a scalpel, delicately slicing through diplomatic defenses to extract secrets. The term honey trap became part of the espionage lexicon, a phrase that sounds almost whimsical until you realize it involved real people in perilous situations. In the 1960s, Christine Keeler and the Profumo affair rocked British politics, a scandal involving a government minister and a Soviet naval attaché that could have been lifted straight from a spy novel. The moral of the story: in the game of international intrigue, the bedroom was as much a battlefield as any war zone. Moving beyond espionage, the post-war period also saw societies grappling with the uncomfortable truths of wartime sexual economies. The forced sterilizations and eugenics programs of the Nazis were laid bare during the Nuremberg trials, leading to international condemnation and a re-evaluation of human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, was a direct response to these atrocities, seeking to ensure that such violations would never happen again. It was a noble goal, though, as history has shown, far from a foolproof solution. In Japan, the legacy of comfort women remains a thorny issue. Despite multiple apologies and compensation efforts, the scars of this dark chapter linger, with survivors and their families still seeking justice and recognition. In 2015, Japan and South Korea reached a controversial agreement to finally and irreversibly resolve the issue, but the conversation is far from over. It's a stark reminder that the past is never truly past, especially when it comes to matters of justice and historical memory. The economic context of the post-war period also played a significant role in shaping societal views on sex and power. The economic boom of the 1950s and 60s brought prosperity to many Western nations, but also reinforced traditional gender roles. Women, who had stepped up during the war, were now encouraged, or rather instructed, to return to the home and embrace domesticity. The economic policies of the time, including the GI Bill in the U.S., were designed to reintegrate soldiers into civilian life, often at the expense of the women who had kept the home fires burning. Yet, underneath this veneer of prosperity and conformity, the seeds of change were quietly taking root. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s owe much to the wartime experiences of their predecessors. Women who had tasted independence were not content to simply revert to their pre-war roles. The fight for equal pay, reproductive rights, and workplace equality became the new battlefronts, challenging the status quo with the same tenacity that had seen them through the darkest days of the war. And let's not forget the cultural shifts. The post-war world saw an explosion of media and entertainment that both reflected and shaped societal norms. Films, literature, and music explored themes of freedom, sexuality, and rebellion. James Bond, that quintessential Cold War icon, epitomized the allure and danger of the spy world, mixing charm with lethal efficiency. His escapades were a testament to the enduring appeal of the seductive spy, a character rooted in the very real histories we've explored. But the romanticized image of the spy, or wartime heroine, often glosses over the gritty realities faced by these individuals. The espionage tactics and sexual economies of World War II were born out of desperation and survival, not glamour. For every James Bond, there were countless unnamed agents who risked everything, often with little recognition or reward. The resilience of those who survived these dark chapters is a testament to human grit and the will to endure. So, what can we take away as we wrap up this historical deep dive? The practices of World War II have left a complicated legacy. They remind us that power and sex have always been intertwined, whether in the clandestine world of espionage or the more overt arenas of politics and society. While we've made strides in recognizing and addressing these issues, the echoes of the past still resonate. The myths of wartime heroism and seduction hold a certain allure, but it's the reality, the resilience of survivors, long fight for justice, the push for equality that truly matters. In the end, history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry of human experience, woven with both light and shadow. As we continue to learn from the past, let's carry forward the stories of those who lived through it, acknowledging both their struggles and their triumphs. Because ultimately, it's through understanding where we've been that we can better navigate where we're going. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, ponder the resilience of the human spirit, and remember that history is not just about dates and battles, but about people. People like you and me, caught in the currents of change, striving for a better world. You spring out of bed, or rather, off your straw-stuffed mattress, coughing off a cloud of dust that's more familiar than comforting. Welcome to another day in your medieval European village, where the air is as thick with activity as it is with smoke from countless hearths. Forget the modern luxury of a quiet start. Here, the rooster's crow is your smartphone alarm, and it doesn't snooze. Let's wander into your kitchen, a place that would make any modern chef break into a cold sweat. At the heart of it all is the open hearth, a blazing center of both culinary magic and potential disaster. It's a smoky, soot-covered beast that sits in the middle of the room, as much a hazard as it is a necessity. Cooking is not just about whipping up a meal, but an exercise in not burning your house down. Instead of a sleek, stainless steel stove, you're working with a cast-iron cauldron or a clay pot, hanging precariously over the flames. Your utensils are rudimentary at best. A wooden spoon, a knife that would make a butter knife look like a samurai sword, and maybe a spit for roasting if you're feeling fancy. The kitchen setup is a testament to human ingenuity, or maybe just stubbornness, because somehow you're still expected to create edible food with these tools. Now, forget refrigeration. Your medieval life is all about embracing the art of food storage in a world where fresh is a fleeting concept. Salt, smoke, and sun are your best friends, turning your kitchen into a high-stakes game of guess the shelf life. You're preserving meat like a pro, using salt to draw out moisture and keep it from going off. Fish, you're hanging it up to dry or smoking it over a slow-burning fire, praying it won't taste like a campfire when all's said and done. The lack of electricity means you're living in a perpetual state of culinary roulette. There's no trusty fridge humming in the corner, just a cool cellar or a hole in the ground if you're lucky. Cheese, one of the few medieval indulgences, is wrapped in wax or cloth, aging away and hopefully not turning into a petri dish of bacteria. It's a delicate balance, and sometimes you win, and sometimes you lose. Cue the surprise stomach ache. Let's not forget the bread, the staple that's practically a medieval currency. You're grinding your own grain, which is a workout in itself, using a quern stone. Bread is baked in communal ovens, a social event that's both practical and a bit of a party. It's a daily ritual that's as much about survival as it is about community bonding over who has the most perfectly risen loaf. Every meal is a reflection of the seasons and the whims of Mother Nature. No strawberries in December here. Seasonal eating isn't a hipster trend, it's a reality. In the spring, you're feasting on fresh greens. In summer, it's the bounty of the fields, and come winter, you're digging into turnips and whatever's left in the root cellar. It's a cycle that's dictated by the land, not by your cravings. The medieval kitchen is a place where creativity meets necessity, where every meal is a small miracle of resourcefulness. You're not just cooking, you're surviving, and doing it with a flair that only comes from centuries of trial and error. It's a world where every day is a battle against the elements, and you're the unsung hero, armed with nothing more than a wooden spoon and a lot of hope. Ah, bread. A staple so pivotal it might as well have its own medieval fan club. But before you get too excited about the smell of freshly baked loaves wafting through the village, let's get one thing straight. Medieval bread wasn't exactly the fluffy, golden delight we envision. It was more like a loaf-shaped rock, a solid reminder that life was tough, and so was dinner. Your morning starts with a workout that would make any modern gym-goer proud, or at least winded. You're grinding grain with a quern stone, task that's less a simple chore and more a full-body exercise regimen. Forget CrossFit, this is cross grain. It's a grind, literally, but it's necessary if you want your daily bread. And let's not forget, this grain didn't come cheap. The cost of wheat was a constant thorn in the side of medieval households. Depending on the year and the whims of harvest, grain prices could swing like a medieval mood ring. In good times, a bushel might fetch a modest price, but in bad times, it was the medieval equivalent of a bidding war on eBay. Now, let's talk about those communal ovens. Picture this, a giant stone oven sitting in the heart of the village, a place where the townsfolk congregate not just for the practical purpose of baking, but for a bit of gossip and camaraderie too. It's like a bake-off meets a town hall meeting, minus the Hollywood glamour. These ovens were essential, as individual households didn't often have the means, or space, for their own. So, you'd make your dough at home, then shuffle over to the communal oven, hoping your loaf wouldn't end up being used as a makeshift weapon. Despite the romantic notion of a united community breaking bread together, let's not sugarcoat it. These gatherings also served as a stark reminder of disparity. If you could afford to add a little barley or rye to your wheat, your bread might actually resemble something edible. But if you were skimming the bottom of the barrel, literally, your loaf might turn out more sawdust than substance. And while we're busting myths, let's tackle that romantic image of the endless feast presided over by a jolly, rotund lord. Sure, the nobility had their banquets, but these were rare, extravagant affairs, not the everyday norm. For the average peasant, food scarcity was a constant companion. Malnutrition was rampant, and many lived perpetually on the edge of starvation. The idea of a balanced diet was as distant as the moon, and the only thing more common than hunger was the back-breaking labor needed to stave it off. You see, medieval life wasn't just a daily grind in the literal sense. It was a struggle for sustenance. The average peasant diet was heavy on bread and porridge, with the occasional vegetable thrown in for good measure. Meat was a luxury, and even when it was available, it was often salted or dried beyond recognition. The irony of the medieval table isn't lost on us. While the lords feasted on roast swan, yes, swan, the common folk were lucky to have a bowl of gruel that didn't taste like despair. The harsh reality is that food scarcity and malnutrition weren't just personal problems, but societal ones. They shaped politics, economies, and even the fabric of medieval life. When the harvest failed, it wasn't just a bad year for farmers. It was a crisis that could topple economies and ignite peasant revolts. The very bread you struggled to make each morning was a symbol of survival, a tangible connection to the land, and a reminder of just how precarious life could be. So, as you heft your stone-like loaf from the communal oven, take a moment to appreciate the shared struggle of the medieval masses. This bread, humble and hard as it may be, is the fruit of your labor and the lifeblood of your community. It's a testament to resilience, a nod to the enduring spirit of those who came before us. And while it's easy to fantasize about the lavish feasts of yore, remember, in the world of medieval Europe, it was the bread, not the banquet, that truly told the tale of life and survival. So, after you've conquered the Herculean task of baking that bread, which doubles as a medieval dumbbell workout, it's time to turn your attention to the midday meal. Now, don't get too excited. This isn't the time for a lavish spread that would make even a modern Sunday brunch look pedestrian. No, your meal is more a testament to the art of making the bland somewhat bearable. Let's talk about spices. Yes, those tiny, magical ingredients that are the reason your ancestors didn't curse every meal under their breath. In a world where the average dish could best be described as brown, spices were the culinary equivalent of Instagram filters, transformative, a touch of exotic, and occasionally expensive enough to make you wonder if the meal was worth it. Pepper in particular was a superstar, the Beyoncé of the spice world, if you will. It was so valuable that it was often used as currency. There are records from the 13th century that show a pound of pepper costing roughly the same as a sheep. Yes, you heard right. A sheep. That's a lot of bar for your buck. The spice trade was medieval Europe's version of the stock market, with fortunes made and lost on the whims of supply and demand. It was a global network that stretched all the way from the East Indies to the markets of Venice and beyond. Ships laden with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg navigated dangerous waters, their cargo more precious than gold. By the time these spices reached your medieval village, they'd have passed through so many hands that their cost could rival that of a small plot of land. But why all the fuss over a sprinkle of nutmeg or a dash of cinnamon? Well, apart from making your boiled turnips slightly more palatable, spices held a certain mystique. They were the original luxury items, the Prada handbags of the pantry, if you will. Owning them meant status, sophistication, and a taste of the far-off lands where they originated. It was about more than just flavor. It was about a connection to the wider world, a glimpse beyond the familiar fields and forests of your daily life. Now, let's debunk the myth of the endless medieval banquet, a feast so grand that it would make even the most extravagant modern wedding look modest. Sure, such banquets did exist, but they were rare, reserved for weddings, coronations, or the occasional peace treaty between warring nobles. The reality for most people was far less glamorous. The average peasant's midday meal was simple, utilitarian, and designed to fuel an afternoon of back-breaking labor in the fields. A typical repast might include a thick pottage, a kind of hearty stew made with whatever vegetables were in season, and sometimes enriched with a scrap of meat if you were lucky or persuasive. Our romantic image of medieval banquets is largely influenced by later Renaissance paintings and literature, which portrayed these events as opulent affairs with platters of roasted meats, shimmering jellies, and of course, the obligatory swan stuffed with even more exotic birds. But let's not forget that these depictions were often more about propaganda than reality, designed to showcase the wealth and power of the person hosting the feast. In truth, the average medieval banquet was as much about politics as it was about food, a chance for nobles to flex their economic muscle and secure alliances. For the common folk, though, the closest they might get to a feast was on a saint's day or a local fair, when the communal spirit and a rare abundance of food created a temporary escape from the everyday grind. On these occasions, the village might come together to roast a pig, brew a bit of ale, and dance away the cares of the world. It was a time to celebrate survival, to indulge in the rare luxury of a full stomach, and to remind themselves that life, while often harsh, could also be a shared joy. Spices, therefore, were more than just a culinary indulgence. They were symbols of a world far larger and more complex than the daily toil of medieval life. They connected people across oceans and continents, fueling trade routes and economic systems that shaped the course of history. And while our modern palates might take their availability for granted, in medieval Europe, a pinch of pepper or a hint of cinnamon was a precious taste of the extraordinary. So, as you sit down to your midday meal, a humble affair compared to the feasts of legends, take a moment to appreciate the spices that transform your porridge from a mere sustenance to a momentary escape. They're a reminder of the global connections that existed even in the supposedly insular world of medieval Europe. And remember, while your table might not groan under the weight of 1,000 delicacies, each bite is a testament to resilience, survival, and the enduring human quest for a bit of flavor in the face of adversity. And just like that, the day rolls on. With bellies filled and spirits briefly lifted, it's back to the fields or the workshop, where the rhythm of medieval life, dictated by the seasons, the sun, and the whims of nature, continues its relentless march. But as you labor under the afternoon sun, let the memory of that spiced meal linger, a small but powerful reminder of the world beyond your village and the enduring connections that bind us all. As the sun climbs its afternoon arc, find yourself thinking about the next major task, keeping your precious proteins from turning into medieval biohazards. Welcome to the gritty world of meat and fish preservation, where every technique sounds like a medieval torture method, but is actually about keeping your diet from becoming a microbial experiment. Let's start with salting, the MVP of medieval meat preservation. Salt isn't just a seasoning here, it's a lifeline. It draws out moisture, creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria, the medieval equivalent of a hostile work environment. Salt was so crucial that entire economies and cities were built around its trade. Just look at the Venetian Republic, which basically rode a wave of salt and spice to become a maritime powerhouse. Back in the 13th century, a pound of salt could cost you around 4 pence, roughly half a day's wages for a laborer. So, when you're salting that pork, remember, you're not just preserving dinner, you're handling medieval gold dust. Smoking, another preservation method, is like the hipster cousin of salting. It's all about the art of infusing flavor while extending shelf life. Think of it as the original BBQ, minus the Instagram posts. Smoking meat and fish was a communal activity, often done in smokehouses that doubled as neighborhood gossip hubs. The process could take days, with fish hanging in rows like scaly flags of survival. What you're left with is a product that's half food, half smoke signal. Now, let's dive into pickling, not just the domain of hipsters and deli aficionados, but a medieval necessity. Pickling involved submerging vegetables, fish, or even meats in vinegar or brine. It was a culinary Hail Mary for when you want to keep something edible for months. Picture barrels of pickled herring stored in cellars, vast reserves against the leaner months when fresh catches were as scarce as a humble lord. And if you think the idea of pickled meat sounds odd, remember, in a world without refrigeration, odd was often synonymous with smart. Speaking of scarcity, let's talk about hunting rights. These were a big deal, and not just because everyone wanted a taste of venison or wild boar. Hunting was heavily regulated by the nobility, who treated forests like their personal game reserves. To the wealthy, hunting was a sport, a chance to show off their prowess and social status. But for the average peasant, it was often a matter of survival. Poaching, hunting without permission, was both a crime and a necessity. Steal a deer from the king's forest, and you risked severe punishment, from hefty fines to the loss of a hand. Yet for many, the risk was worth it, when faced with the choice between starvation and snaring a rabbit in the dead of night. Let's just say the medieval peasant didn't need a detailed cost-benefit analysis. Poaching was a form of silent rebellion, where the law of the land clashed with the law of the stomach. This brings us to the medieval diet's reliance on local availability. Forget about avocados in January or mangoes in March. Your menu was dictated by what the land around you could offer. If you lived near the coast, your meals might feature more fish than meat. Inland, it was all about whatever livestock you could raise or game you could secretly snare. The medieval diet was a patchwork quilt of regional specialties. In Flanders, you might enjoy a hearty stew of beef and ale, while in Tuscany, it was all about beans and olive oil. Back then, regional cuisine wasn't a trendy restaurant menu, but a reality of life. The lack of long-distance transport options meant that food culture was intensely local. What you ate was intimately tied to geography, climate, and the whims of nature. So, as you ponder your afternoon tasks, remember that your medieval counterparts weren't just cooking. They were participating in an intricate dance of survival, resourcefulness, and rebellion. Each meal was a testament to the delicate balance between nature's bounty and humanity's ingenuity. While the romantic notion of nights hunting through the forest is appealing, the reality was a tangled web of rights, restrictions, and necessity. Hunting and food preservation were not just about sustenance, they were about power and control. They shaped social hierarchies, informed economic policies, and even sparked revolts. Food wasn't just fuel for the body, it was the foundation of society itself. In this world, every meal was a testament to survival, a reflection of the social and political forces at play. As you sit down to your evening meal, take a moment to appreciate the art and effort that went into putting it on the table. From the salt that preserved your meat to the fire that smoked your fish, each bite is a reminder of the resourcefulness and resilience that defined medieval life. In a world where nothing came easy, every meal was a victory, a small triumph against the odds. As evening approaches, with its cool shadows and the distant clamor of a bustling village, your day is far from over. But for now, let the satisfaction of a preserved bounty linger, a savory testament to human ingenuity and the relentless quest for sustenance in a world that offered no guarantees. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, it's time to wrap up the day with supper, a meal that promises to be both a relief and a revelation. You find yourself seated at a wooden table, ready to tackle whatever the medieval kitchen guards have bestowed upon you this evening. If you're lucky, it's hearty and warm. If not, it's still better than gnawing on a twig. Now, let's talk beverages. Forget your modern-day kale smoothies and artisanal lattes. In medieval Europe, the drink of choice was ale. This wasn't your hipster craft brew, but a staple of daily life, part hydration, part nutrition, and all necessity. Water could be dodgy at best, often a cocktail of who knows what from the local stream. Ale, however, was brewed and boiled, making it safer to drink. It was your medieval multivitamin, providing calories and some nutrients when food was scarce. Even children drank it, but don't worry, it was lower in alcohol than the stuff you're sipping at your local pub. Consider it the original energy drink, the Gatorade of the Middle Ages. For the wealthier classes, wine was the beverage of choice, a symbol of sophistication and status. Imported from regions like Bordeaux or Burgundy, it was an expensive indulgence, about as accessible to the average peasant as a private jet. But wine wasn't just for the upper crust. In vineyard-rich areas, even peasants might partake, albeit of a quality that might make your modern sommelier cry into their decanter. Let's not forget about mead, the honey wine that's been having a bit of a renaissance in modern times. Back then, it was the drink of choice for those who could access honey, a sweet luxury that was often hard to come by. Mead was more common in the northern parts of Europe, where bees thrived, and honey wasn't just a sweet treat but a staple in brewing. Taverns were the medieval equivalent of today's coffee shops or bars, where the community gathered to share news, stories, and yes, a drink or two. They were more than just places to imbibe. They were hubs of social interaction, where business deals were struck, gossip was exchanged, and songs were sung. The alehouse was the great equalizer, where peasant and lord alike could find solace and camaraderie over a tankard of ale. Think of it as medieval social media, minus the trolls and cat memes. Monasteries played a crucial role in the culinary landscape as well. Monks were the original brewmasters, and many monasteries had their own breweries. They took their craft seriously, refining brewing techniques and experimenting with flavors. Some of the beer styles developed in these monastic breweries are still around today, a testament to their brewing prowess. And it wasn't just about the alcohol. Monasteries were also centers of culinary innovation, preserving and developing recipes that would shape European cuisine for centuries. As you finish your supper, it's time to reflect on how the medieval approach to cooking and dining reveals the broader societal structures and constraints of the era. Food was a window into the medieval soul, offering insights into the harsh realities and small joys of daily life. The way people cooked, ate, and drank was shaped by a complex web of social hierarchies, economic pressures, and environmental challenges. The medieval kitchen was a microcosm of society, where the disparity between the haves and have-nots was as stark as the difference between a lord's banquet and a peasant's pottage. The scarcity of resources and the difficulty of preserving food meant that every meal was a small miracle, a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. Yet, it also highlighted the harsh inequities of the time, where a bad harvest could mean the difference between life and death for the poor, while the wealthy dined on imported luxuries. Cooking in medieval Europe was an exercise in creativity and constraint, where the limitations of the time forced people to innovate. It was about making the most of what was available, whether that meant using every part of an animal or finding new ways to flavor an otherwise bland dish. It was a lesson in resourcefulness, a reminder that necessity truly is the mother of invention. So, as you contemplate the remnants of your medieval meal, take a moment to appreciate the legacy of those who came before us. Their struggles and successes in the kitchen laid the groundwork for the culinary world we know today. The humble ale you drank, the bread you baked, and the spices you savored are all part of a rich tapestry of history, woven together by countless hands across generations. In the end, the story of medieval cooking is a story of survival, innovation, and community. It's a testament to the enduring human spirit, the ability to create something meaningful out of the simplest of ingredients. And as you step away from the medieval table, let the lessons of the past linger. They remind us that while the tools and techniques may have changed, the essence of cooking, bringing people together, nourishing the body and soul, remains timeless. It's the early 1800s, and the Industrial Revolution is in full swing, like a rock concert of clanging metal and steam. You're standing outside a towering factory, the latest marvel in human achievement, or so everyone keeps telling you. This place is supposed to be the future, a shining beacon of progress. But as you step closer, the smell of soot and sweat hits you like an uninvited guest at dinner. Welcome to the world of Victorian factory work, where dreams go to die in 12-hour shifts. You've heard the buzz. Factories are where the action is. Forget the pastoral life of farming, who needs fresh air and sunlight when you can have soot in your lungs and oil on your skin. The excitement of machinery, the promise of a steady paycheck. It's irresistible, like a carnival ride that's slightly more dangerous than advertised. This is the era when the promise of modernization and wealth lures thousands into factories. But the price? Oh, it's a doozy. Let's talk about those 12-hour shifts. Yep, 12 hours. And that's on a good day. If you're unlucky, you might clock in at 14 or 16. Sure, the factory foremen say it's good for discipline, like getting a haircut with a lawnmower is good for efficiency. And forget weekends, because those are just a myth for the idle rich. You'll be working 6 days a week, and if you're lucky, you might get half a day off on Sunday. Just enough time to wash off the grime and pretend you have a life outside those brick walls. The machinery itself is a marvel, or so they say. The spinning jennies and power looms are the pride of the Industrial Revolution. But these machines are as safe as juggling chainsaws. Safety guards, never heard of them. Lose a finger, that's a write-off. In 1833, the Factory Act tried to put some brakes on this madness by limiting work for children under 9. But if you're older, well, it's open season. No one's counting your hours, unless it's the hours until the next accident. And let's not even start on the charmingly non-existent labor laws. Workers' rights, that's a joke. The factory owners live in mansions while you scrape by in cramped, damp tenements. The pay is a pittance, just enough to keep you coming back. In 1830, the average factory worker earned about 15 shillings a week, which sounds like a lot, until you realize it barely covers rent and food. Cheese is a luxury. Meat is a distant dream. Your diet is bread, more bread, and the occasional potato. And let's not forget the health hazards of the job. Lung diseases from inhaling fibers, deafness from the constant noise, and if you're really lucky, you might escape with only a minor case of tuberculosis. The romantic notion of the Industrial Revolution paints a picture of innovation and progress, but you're here to bust that myth wide open. For the workers, it's a daily grind of monotony and danger. The factories are like beasts, consuming human lives for the profit of a select few. And yet, people flock to these places, drawn by the hope of something better, or at least something different. It's a gamble, but when you're facing poverty on the farm, it feels like the only game in town. In this gritty world, the factory is both a prison and a lifeline. It's the paradox of progress, creating wealth while trapping the workers in cycles of poverty. You're a cog in a machine, but without you, the machine doesn't run. And that, my friend, is the twisted irony of the Industrial Revolution. So strap on your clogs, keep your fingers crossed, and hope that, when the whistle blows, you're still in one piece. Because in the world of Victorian factories, the stakes are high, and the odds are never in your favor. But here's the kicker, those odds. They've been stacked against you from the get-go, courtesy of the economic forces that make the factory system the world's worst game of Monopoly. Let's break it down, because the Victorian era was no picnic, unless your idea of a picnic involves chronic hunger and questionable sanitation. First off, let's talk wages. Imagine you're making about 15 shillings a week, which sounds quaint until you realize it's the equivalent of pocket change when rent alone can swallow half of that. You're looking at about 7 shillings for a cramped room in a tenement where privacy is as mythical as a unicorn. These places are the architectural equivalent of a sardine can, only less charmingly fishy. A 2-up, 2-down home, 2 rooms on each floor, is the height of luxury for the working class. But don't let the numbers fool you. It's more of a 2 cram in as many as you can situation. If you've got more than 2 kids, and let's face it, most families did, you're playing human Tetris every night. Now you might think, okay, I'll just cut back on food costs. And sure, you could try that, but it's already slim pickings. Bread, your staple, costs about 1 shilling a week. Potatoes are your second course, and if you're feeling fancy, you might add a sliver of cheese or a splash of milk. Meat, forget it. Unless you're talking about the occasional scrap of bacon, which is more of a seasoning than a meal. Eating meat is like winning the lottery, and since you haven't won the lottery, back to bread it is. And speaking of food, let's not forget those charming Victorian markets, where food safety standards are practically non-existent. Freshness is a concept lost on the era, and you're just as likely to buy rotten vegetables as you are fresh ones. The irony, you're part of the generation bringing about modern refrigeration, yet the only thing chilling in your home is the draft coming through the walls. This economic straitjacket isn't just a coincidence. The industrialists, with their monocles and top hats, and that's not just a stereotype, know exactly what they're doing. By keeping wages low, they ensure a steady stream of workers who have no choice but to return to the factory floor. It's a vicious cycle, as relentless as the machines you work beside. And let's face it, the folks in charge didn't get rich by being generous. They've got their mansions and their Sunday roasts, and they're not losing sleep over your empty plate. So why stay? Why not pack up your dreams and head for greener pastures? Well, the truth is, there aren't many greener pastures. Agricultural sector is no better, offering little more than hard labor for even less pay. Plus, the cities, with their gleaming factories and promise of opportunity, have all the allure of a mirage in the desert. It's the promise that things will get better, that somehow the next paycheck will stretch a little further, that keeps you gripping that factory punch card like it's a lifeline. Of course, the economic forces don't just stop at your wallet. They bleed into every aspect of life, affecting health, education, and even family dynamics. With both parents working long hours, kids are left to fend for themselves, or worse, join the workforce far too young. The Factory Act of 1833 might have set some rules, but enforcement was another story entirely, like trying to herd cats with a piece of string. Health, don't get me started. Living conditions are a breeding ground for disease. Cholera, typhus, smallpox, take your pick. These are the uninvited guests at every Victorian dinner table. Medical care is rudimentary at best, and if you think your local doctor's got a handle on things, think again. Bloodletting and leeches are still seen as cutting-edge treatments, so good luck with that. And yet, within this grim tableau, there's a strange sort of camaraderie. It's the we're in this together mentality that keeps spirits as buoyant as a lead balloon. Workers band together, not just for survival, but for the hope of change. The early rumblings of workers' rights and trade unions are beginning to stir, although they're more whisper than roar at this point. Strikes and protests are dangerous, often met with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for a tax audit. Still, as bleak as it is, there's a resilience here that defies the drudgery. You find moments of humor, of solidarity, in the unlikeliest places. And somehow, amidst the grind, there's still room for hope. Hope that the machines you feed daily might one day yield a better life. Or at the very least, hope that tonight's bread isn't stale. And so the wheel keeps turning, driven by the relentless march of progress and the harsh economic realities of the time. You're caught in the gears, but without you, the machine grinds to a halt. That's the paradox of the age. The very forces that trap you are also the forces that keep the world moving forward. As the factory whistle blows and you head home, you carry that paradox with you, etched into every weary step. And so, as the factory whistle echoes its final note of the day, you trudge home, dragging the weight of the world's most paradoxical system. What's playing out here isn't just the daily grind. It's a masterclass in how not to run a society, brought to you by the Victorian elite and their laissez-faire philosophy. Yep, laissez-faire, that fancy French term for let it be, which is exactly what the politicians did. They let the factories be, the child labour be, the hazardous conditions be. If the Victorian era had a motto, it might as well have been, never interrupt while disaster is in progress. You see, the 19th century political landscape was a hotbed of inaction, a place where the government's default setting was doing as little as possible. Fear of meddling in the glorious machine of capitalism was rampant. Politicians were convinced that if they tweaked even the smallest gear, like, say, establishing a minimum wage or enforcing basic safety standards, the whole economic engine would sputter and die. It's like refusing to get a checkup because you're afraid the doctor might find something. Spoiler alert, they will, and it won't be pretty. The government's reluctance to intervene was rooted in the belief that the free market would magically fix everything. The invisible hand of the market was supposed to guide businesses to do the right thing, like some economic fairy godmother. Except, plot twist, it didn't. Instead, the invisible hand gave a thumbs up to low wages and long hours while waving a cheerful goodbye to workers' health and well-being. The factory acts of the 1830 were supposed to be the cavalry, galloping in to save the day. But these laws were like those, batteries not included, toys, promising on the outside, lacking in execution. Now, let's talk about those so-called benevolent factory owners. Ah, yes, the romanticized image of the kindly industrialist, the paternal figure who looks after his workers like a father hen with his chicks. Spoiler alert, that's more fairy tale than fact. Sure, there were a few philanthropists who genuinely cared, like Robert Owen, who set up his own little utopia in New Lanark. But for every Owen, there was a dozen more who saw their workers as little more than cogs in the profit machine. These benevolent factory owners were about as common as unicorns, and just as likely to offer you paid sick leave. Meanwhile, the power of trade unions was beginning to stir, albeit slowly. Forming a union was akin to signing up for a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with the factory owners, who were less than thrilled with the idea of organized labor. Early unions were like the underdog in a boxing match, scrappy and determined, but often outmatched. The Talpuddle martyrs of 1834, 6 farm laborers who were shipped off to Australia just for forming a union, were a cautionary tale of what could happen if you dared to challenge the status quo. But their story sparked outrage and sympathy, showing that even the smallest ripple can create waves. The slow march toward labor reform was like watching paint dry in real time, but it was happening. The Chartist movement, with its demands for political reform, was gaining momentum, pushing for something as radical as voting rights for working men. Imagine that, having a say in the system that dictated your life. But change was coming at a glacial pace, one protest at a time, one strike at a time, each one chipping away at the rock-hard resistance of the establishment. It's easy to see why the Victorian era is romanticized, with its grand visions of progress and innovation. The picturesque image of the bustling city, the triumph of technology over nature, these are the stuff of legends. But beneath that shiny veneer was a world where the gears of industry were greased with human sweat and tears. It's a tale of two worlds, one of dazzling achievements and another of grinding exploitation. So as you collapse into bed, you're not just a factory worker. You're part of a larger story, a chapter in the ongoing struggle for workers' rights and social justice. And even though the odds seem stacked against you, the fact that the story continues means there's still hope. Hope that one day the politicians will step up, that the invisible hand will stop giving the thumbs up to misery, and that the romantic tales of benevolent factory owners will be more than just bedtime stories. And so, the Victorian era rolls on, a complex tapestry of progress and peril, innovation and inequality. The next day, you'll rise again to face the factory floor. But as you do, remember, your story is part of something bigger. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of collective action, and to the unyielding hope that one day things might just change. Until then, keep your head down and your humor sharp. It's the best armor you've got in the world's least enjoyable game of Monopoly. And so, as you lay there, contemplating the Victorian version of the Hunger Games known as factory work, let's dive into a day in the life of the folks who clocked in before coffee was even a thing. We're talking before sunrise, when the only alarm clock was a knock on the door from the local knocker-upper, an actual job where someone would tap on your window with a long stick to make sure you didn't oversleep. Because let's face it, being late was not an option. The factory whistle waits for no one. Once you've scrambled out of bed, if you can call a lumpy sack of straw a bed, and gulped down a breakfast that's more air than substance, you're off to the factory. Streets are a bustling maze of soot-streaked workers, all heading to their respective purgatories. You're not alone in this. The average factory employed hundreds, if not thousands, of workers. In 1851, the textile mills of Manchester alone employed over 100,000 souls, all packed into a city where the sun rarely penetrated the smog. Now, let's talk about your co-workers. They're not just adults like you, they're children. Yep, kids as young as 5 or 6 were part of the workforce. Because what better way to prepare for life than a daily dose of drudgery? History books often paint a picture of cherubic little ones frolicking in fields, but in the Victorian era, many were more likely to be found under a loom or cleaning out machinery with their tiny hands, because their small size made them ideal for getting into those hard-to-reach places. It's like a twisted version of Cinderella, minus the fairy godmother. Charles Dickens, with his knack for nailing the grim reality, described child labor in Oliver Twist as a situation where children were so strongly tempted to steal their daily bread that there were almost as many convicts as paupers. It was a world where even the most basic of safety measures were as rare as a day off. If you're wondering why workers didn't just up and leave, remember this. The average wage for these kids was about $1 a week, a pittance even by the low standards of the time. But for families scraping by, every little bit counted. Speaking of safety, or the lack thereof, let's address the delightful health hazards. Victorian factories were like a twisted obstacle course, where everything seemed designed to maim or kill. Cotton mills were notorious for the clouds of fluff that filled the air, which workers inhaled with every breath. This led to something charmingly called mill fever, a respiratory illness that was as fun as it sounds. Contemporary reports offer vivid descriptions, like this gem from a factory inspector in 1833. The dust and fluff are so thick that it is impossible to see across the room. Breathing in this daily cocktail was a surefire ticket to chronic bronchitis, but hey, at least it was free. If you weren't coughing up a lung, you might be dodging the machinery. Victorian factories were full of moving parts, all whirring and clanking with the kind of menace usually reserved for horror films. The power looms and spinning mules were marvels of engineering, but without safety guards, they were also marvels of mayhem. Injuries were common. Losing a finger was practically a rite of passage, and those who were particularly unlucky might find themselves minus a limb. The factory owners, ever the compassionate sort, often chalked this up to worker carelessness rather than a lack of safety features. Then there's the noise, a cacophony so loud it could make a rock concert seem like a lullaby. Workers were subjected to a relentless symphony of clattering looms and thundering machinery, which didn't just damage hearing, but made communication nearly impossible. Imagine trying to shout over the din all day, every day. It's no wonder that deafness was a common affliction among factory workers, often dismissed as mill deafness, as if the name somehow made it less terrible. Breaks were as rare as unicorns. If you were lucky, you might get a few minutes to gulp down a midday meal, typically bread and a bit of cheese if you were living large. Water was available, but often contaminated, adding a fun element of Russian roulette to the simple act of quenching your thirst. After all, who doesn't love a side of cholera with their hydration? Despite these conditions, the idea of complaining was about as welcome as a skunk at a garden party. The fear of being fired was always looming, because there were plenty of people ready to fill your shoes, or clogs, as it were. The lucky few who did manage to voice their concerns often found themselves without a job, or worse, blacklisted, Their names circulated among factory owners like a do not hire list. It's easy to romanticize the era with its grand steam engines and industrial might, but the reality was a daily grind that chewed up and spat out workers with alarming regularity. Yet somehow, amidst the clamor and chaos, there was resilience. Workers banded together in small acts of defiance, whether it was a stolen moment of laughter or sharing what little they had. It was these moments that kept hope alive, hope that maybe, just maybe, change was on the horizon. Late 19th century saw the rise of more organized labor movements, which began to chip away at the status quo. Unions were forming, albeit secretly at first, and the fight for workers' rights was gaining momentum. The strikes and protests that followed were like sparks in the industrial darkness, lighting the way for future reforms. These early efforts laid the groundwork for the labor laws we take for granted today, but they came at a cost, often paid in blood, sweat, and tears by those brave enough to stand up and demand better. As you drift off to sleep, you're not just dreaming of a better tomorrow, you're part of the fight to make it happen. The Victorian factory system may have been brutal, but it was also a crucible, forging a spirit of determination and solidarity that would eventually lead to a fairer, more humane workplace. Until then, keep your wits sharp and your humor sharper, because in the world of Victorian factories, laughter was often the best, and only medicine. As you drift off to sleep, dreaming of a better tomorrow, let's take a look at the myths and realities of Victorian factory life and the stubborn persistence of progress. You see, the Victorian era has been painted with the brush of nostalgia so frequently, it's practically dripping with sepia tones. It's often framed as a time of unparalleled innovation, a golden age of steam and steel, where the soot and grime are conveniently airbrushed out. But let's not kid ourselves. This was a world where health and safety was as foreign a concept as Wi-Fi, and where the average worker had about as much job security as a snowman in July. First up, let's tackle the myth of the benevolent factory owner. Picture this, a kindly old gentleman with a twinkle in his eye and a pocket full of shillings ready to sprinkle upon his workers. Romantic, right, but here's the kicker. This idea is about as factual as a unicorn sighting. Sure, there were a few exceptions like Robert Owen, who tried to create a workers' utopia at New Lanark, offering decent housing and education. But for every Owen, there were scores of owners who saw their workers as mere extensions of the machinery. It was a dog-eat-dog world, where the boss's idea of a staff incentive was not firing you for having a cold. Then there's the notion that the Industrial Revolution was an unstoppable train of progress, chugging along with steam-powered enthusiasm. Progress. Yes, but unstoppable. Hardly. The wheels of change were greased with the sweat and tears of workers, and those wheels often got stuck in the mud of social and political resistance. Early reforms were about as effective as a chocolate teapot. The Factory Acts of the 1830 and 40 set limits on working hours for children and women, but they were riddled with loopholes bigger than a factory door. Enforcement was a joke, with inspectors often outnumbered and outmaneuvered by factory owners who knew how to play the system like a fiddle. So what changed? Well, it took the relentless grit of the working class, who fought for every inch of progress. Picture the Chartists, who in the 1830 and 40 campaigned for political reforms like universal male suffrage. They were dismissed by the elite as rabble-rousers, but their demands laid the groundwork for future social change. And let's not forget the trade unions. By the late 19th century, organizations like the Amalgamated Society of Engineers were making strides, pushing for better wages and safer working conditions. They were like the Avengers of the working world, only with more soot and fewer spandex suits. These efforts, over decades, slowly turned the tide. By the end of the 19th century, conditions were improving, albeit glacially. The introduction of the 1878 Factory Act, which finally established regulations for all factories and workshops, was a milestone. It was like finally getting a lifebuoy tossed into the sea of exploitation. Progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. And what about today? Well, modern labor laws owe a debt of gratitude to those Victorian workers who refused to accept their lot. The 8-hour workday, minimum wage, the weekend, all these concepts have roots in the struggles of the past. It's easy to take them for granted, like not having to dodge flying shuttles or breathe in lungfuls of cotton dust. But remember, These rights were hard-won, and complacency is the enemy of progress. Now, why is it so important to debunk these rose-tinted narratives? Because, my friend, history isn't just a collection of quaint stories to be admired from a distance. It's a mirror, reflecting the struggles and triumphs of those who came before us. Romanticizing the past glosses over the harsh realities that people faced, stripping them of their agency and their achievements. It's like watching a movie on mute, missing the dialogue and the depth that make it meaningful. Sure, we've come a long way since the days when the factory floor was a battlefield, but let's not get too comfortable. The gig economy and zero-hour contracts might not involve spinning jennies or power looms, but they echo the insecurity and exploitation of the past. The fight for fair wages and safe working conditions is ongoing, and the lessons of the Victorian era are as relevant as ever. So the next time you clock out of your 9 to 5, spare a thought for those who turned the grindstone of history to make that possible. In the end, the story of the Victorian factory worker is a testament to human resilience, a chronicle of struggle and solidarity that managed to punch through the toughest of times. It's a reminder that change doesn't just happen. It's fought for, inch by painstaking inch, by those who dare to dream of something better. So here's to the workers of the past, who soldiered on in the face of adversity and laid the foundations for the rights we enjoy today. They may have lived in a world of coal and clatter, but their legacy is one of fire and fortitude. And as you lay your head down, remember, history is a living thing. It's not just about where we've been, but where we're going. So keep your eyes open, your humor sharp, and your heart ready to fight for the future. Because in the end, the story isn't over. It's just beginning. You're standing shoulder to shoulder with a band of brothers, the sun glaring off your armor, as you ponder if you'll ever get used to the smell of sweat, leather, and the vague undertone of impending doom. Welcome to the gritty, not-so-glamorous life of a Roman soldier. Forget the glorified tales of heroism and endless victories. This isn't a page ripped from some epic poem. No, it's the unfiltered reality of a legionary who spends more time wrestling with boredom and blisters than basking in glory. First things first, let's talk about your daily grind. You wake up not because you want to, but because a centurion's bellowing voice could wake the dead. Your day kicks off with a gut-busting march, laden down with a hefty 30 kilograms of gear. For context, that's like strapping a small child to your back and taking them on a marathon. Your kit includes the essentials: a gladius, short sword, pilum spear, scutum large shield, and don't forget the lorica segmentata, that snazzy segmented armor. Add a few days' worth of food, a mess kit, a shovel, and other odds and ends, and you've got yourself a mobile torture device. Navigating the Frontlines is no picnic. You're constantly on the lookout for food and shelter, and let's face it, the Roman army didn't exactly book you a room at the nearest inn. You often find yourself constructing a castrum, a makeshift camp, which is Latin for "you're not getting much sleep tonight." Each camp is built according to strict specifications, a rectangular layout with ditches and palisades, because "let's not get ambushed tonight" is the motto every sensible legionary lives by. The Roman military machine runs on discipline like an Italian espresso machine runs on coffee, strong and unyielding. You might think you're a tough cookie, but step out of line, and you'll find yourself digging latrines faster than you can say, "Ave Caesar." The legions are organized with a precision that would make even the most anal-retentive modern manager weep with joy. 10 cohorts make a legion, each cohort divided into centuries, which are, somewhat confusingly, groups of about 80 men rather than 100. It's like they decided to keep things interesting by ignoring basic math. This discipline is the glue that holds the whole operation together, especially when you're knee-deep in the mud of some far-flung province. Forget those romanticized visions of the Roman legions marching in perfect unison, flags fluttering in the wind. It's more like a ragtag band of weary men, grumbling about the weather and dreaming of a heart meal. But despite the grumbling, the discipline is what keeps you alive, what ensures that when the arrows start flying, you're not running around like a headless chicken. Now, let's debunk a few myths. You've probably heard stories of Roman soldiers being these invincible warriors, some kind of ancient super soldiers. Reality check. You're just a guy with a sword, a lot of training, and a healthy fear of your commanding officer. Sure, the Roman legions were a force to be reckoned with, but it wasn't just brute strength. It was their strategy, their adaptability, their sheer stubbornness that made them formidable. And yes, sometimes they lost, and when they did, it was spectacularly messy. Remember the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD? 3 entire legions wiped out in a soggy German forest because someone didn't listen to directions. Oops. Your life as a Roman soldier is a constant balancing act between boredom and terror, with a side dish of aching feet. You spend much of your time on campaigns that feel endless, traversing rough terrains from the scorching sands of North Africa to the icy winds of Britannia. The pay isn't exactly fabulous either, about 225 denarii a year, which, after deductions for food and equipment, leaves you wondering if that promised plot of land upon retirement is really worth it. When the time comes to fight, it's not the noble duel of equals you might imagine. Battles are chaos, a cacophony of clashing metal, shouted orders, and the gut-wrenching realization that your life hangs by a thread. Yet, amidst all this, you find a camaraderie that binds you to your fellow soldiers. You fight not just for Rome, but for the guy next to you who's equally terrified, equally determined to see another sunrise. So, as you march on, remember that the glory of Rome wasn't built on the backs of guards or mythical heroes. It was built by everyday men like you, who endured more than their fair share of hardships and still kept marching. You are the backbone of an empire, though it might not feel that way when you're trudging through another endless day, the weight of your gear digging into your shoulders. Because at the end of the day, you are a Roman soldier, and you've got a job to do. Now, let's get real about your paycheck, or lack thereof. As a Roman soldier, you're making around 225 denarii a year. To give you some context, that's less than a third of what a skilled craftsman in Rome might earn. So much for being the backbone of an empire, right? But hold your horses, or should I say your cavalry, because it's not all bad. There are perks, like the promise of land upon retirement and the occasional loot from a successful campaign. But let's be honest, you might as well be waiting for a snowstorm in the Sahara. Now, before you start dreaming of rolling in piles of gold, let's break down where that money actually goes. Spoiler alert, it's not into a savings account. The military has this nifty little system where they deduct expenses directly from your pay. First up, food. You might think the army would cover your meals, considering you're risking life and limb, but nope. You pay for your daily rations, which usually consist of bread, some olives, and maybe a bit of cheese if you're lucky. And let's not forget the vinegar concoction you drink that's supposed to keep you healthy. Delicious, right. Next on the list, your gear. Remember that 30 kilograms of equipment we talked about? Well, surprise, surprise, you're footing the bill for that too. The armor, weapons, and even the sandals that you will most definitely wear down to threadbare straps on those endless marches, all deducted from your pay. And speaking of sandals, have you tried hiking through Gaul in those things? It's like a spa treatment for your feet, if your idea of a spa is getting trampled by a herd of cattle. Just when you think you've got your finances under control, along comes the occasional special levy. Maybe the emperor needs a new palace or fancy games to keep the populace entertained. So, you and your fellow soldiers are encouraged to contribute. It's like when your friend asks you to chip in for concert tickets, but forgets to mention their front row seats for a band you don't even like. The logistics of keeping an army on the move are like trying to organize a rock band tour with no roadies. You've got to haul food, water, and gear across vast territories, often over rugged terrain that makes you question the sanity of marching in the first place. The Roman army prides itself on its efficiency, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Behind the scenes, you've got a small army of supply officers, engineers and laborers, often slaves or local conscripts, keeping the machine running. Their job is thankless and exhausting, but hey, at least they're not in the front lines. Now, let's debunk the myth of the soldier's supposed wealth. Sure, you might hear tales of Roman soldiers retiring to a life of luxury, but that's about as rare as a unicorn in a toga. Most soldiers end up back on the family farm or in some remote outpost, still working their fingers to the bone just to make ends meet. That plot of land you were promised upon retirement, it might be a barren patch of dirt in a backwater province, but it's yours, and you can grow all the olives and grapes your heart desires, assuming you survive long enough to enjoy it. While we're on the topic of survival, let's talk about the risk factor. Being a Roman soldier isn't just a job, it's a constant high-stakes gamble. You're not just battling enemy forces, you're also up against disease, harsh climates, and the occasional mutiny. The Roman army might be a well-oiled machine, but it's not immune to the chaos of human nature. Leadership can make or break a legion, and one wrong move from a commander can send you spiraling into disaster faster than you can say, "Et tu, brute." Despite these challenges, the camaraderie among soldiers is the stuff of legends. You're in the trenches with your fellow legionaries, sharing hardships, victories, and the occasional swig of whatever alcohol you can get your hands on. This bond is what keeps you going when things get tough, not the promise of riches or glory. It's the knowledge that the guy next to you has got your back, even if you're both ankle-deep in mud and misery. So, while the romanticized image of the Roman soldier as a conquering hero might make for great storytelling, the reality is far more complex. You're not just a cog in the imperial machine. You're part of a brotherhood forged in the fires of adversity. And as you march on, remember that the true wealth of a Roman soldier isn't counted in denarii or land deeds. It's in the shared experiences, the lessons learned, and the unbreakable bonds formed in the crucible of war. Of course, none of this changes the fact that your next payday is still months away, and your stomach is reminding you that olives aren't a food group. But hey, at least you can take comfort in the fact that your life as a Roman soldier is never dull. From the front lines to the pay lines, it's a journey full of unexpected twists, turns, and the occasional lesson in economics that history class never prepared you for. Now, let's dive into the beating heart of the Roman army, the soldiers themselves. Forget the grandiose statues of Caesar and those marble busts of stern-faced generals. The real drama unfolds in the muddy camps, under the canvas of a Roman tent. Here's where you'll find a mix of camaraderie, competition, and the occasional clash of egos that could rival any reality TV show. To start, let's talk about the legionaries. Think of them as the backbone of the military. These guys are your standard-issue Roman soldiers, citizens of the empire, committed to a term of 25 years in service. Yes, you heard that right, 25 years. That's enough time to master every curse word in Latin and maybe invent a few new ones. Your average legionary spends his time training to perfection, marching until his feet feel like they're made of lead, and occasionally confronting the business end of a barbarian's spear. But it's not all doom and gloom. The bonds formed in these legions are often stronger than family ties. After all, when you're standing shield to shield facing a charging enemy, you want to be sure the guy next to you isn't going to run faster than you. Then there are the auxiliaries. These non-citizen troops are the unsung heroes of the Roman military machine, recruited from the empire's far-flung provinces. They're like the Swiss army knife of soldiers, versatile and indispensable. While they might not have the same citizenship perks as the legionaries, they do have one significant incentive: Roman citizenship upon honorable discharge. Talk about a golden ticket. These guys bring their own unique fighting styles to the table, from expert archers from Syria to fierce cavalry from Gaul. They add a splash of color to the otherwise uniform Roman ranks, like the original multicultural crew long before it was cool. But let's not kid ourselves into believing it was all handshakes and high-fives. The social dynamics within the Roman army could get as heated as the sands of the Sahara. With such a diverse group, tensions were inevitable. You had Roman citizens, who sometimes regarded themselves as a cut above the rest, and the auxiliaries, who might see the legionaries as a bit too self-important for their liking. It's like an ancient version of a workplace rivalry, complete with side-eyes and snide remarks. Yet when the going got tough, differences often took a back seat to survival. Nothing says team building like the threat of imminent death. Hierarchies within the army also played a crucial role in the daily grind. At the top, you had the centurions, those grizzled veterans who could make a drill sergeant look like a playground monitor. These guys were the backbone of discipline, leading by example and not afraid to crack some heads, literally, with a vine staff, if things got out of line. It's said that a good centurion could spot a slacking soldier from a mile away, and heaven help you if you were caught. But respect and fear are two sides of the same coin, and a centurion's approval was something every soldier craved, like a kid hoping for an extra slice of cake. However, for every well-oiled machine, there's a creaky cog or two. Enter the Optio and the Tesserarius, the centurion's right-hand men. The Optio was like the assistant manager of your local fast food joint, doing the grunt work and making sure the orders are followed. Meanwhile, The Tesserarius was responsible for night watches and passwords, a job that was as crucial as it was thankless. Mess that up, and you might find yourself on latrine duty for the foreseeable future. Amidst all this, friendships did bloom, often in the most unlikely of places. Soldiers from different backgrounds found common ground in shared hardships and the universal language of military life, complaining, whether it was griping about the weather, the food, or the questionable strategic decisions of their superiors. These shared grievances knit together a tight fabric of fraternity. It's the kind of bond that transcends language and culture, forged in the crucible of adversity. And let's not ignore the role of humor. Gallows humor, to be precise, was a staple in the Roman army. When you've been marching for days with a blister the size of your ego, sometimes all you can do is laugh. Soldiers would swap jokes, tell exaggerated tales of their exploits, and tease each other mercilessly, but always with an undercurrent of affection. It was the ancient equivalent of roasting your friends, a way to blow off steam and remind each other that you're all in it together. Despite all this camaraderie, it's a mistake to paint the Roman army as a monolithic entity marching in perfect harmony. The reality is more like a family reunion where not everyone gets along, but when push comes to shove, they've got each other's backs. The Roman army thrived on diversity, not just in its ranks, but in its tactics and strategies. This melting pot of soldiers and skills gave the army its edge, a testament to the idea that strength lies in differences, not similarities. So, while the marble statues and heroic tales might tell a story of an invincible force, the truth is more nuanced. The Roman army was a living, breathing organism full of contradictions and complexities. It was held together by the grit and determination of its soldiers, who, despite their differences, came together to forge one of history's most formidable military forces. And as you march on, remember that it's not just the victories that define the Roman army, but the human stories woven into its fabric. And speaking of those human stories, let's dive into the political and strategic chess game that shaped the lives of Roman soldiers. Because, let's face it, while you were busy traipsing through the mud and dreaming of a decent meal, there were bigger brains at work plotting the next move in Rome's grand imperial agenda. This wasn't just about glory, it was about power, control, and sometimes pure survival. Julius Caesar. Now there's a name that echoes through the annals of history with all the subtlety of a trumpet blast. While you might picture him with a laurel wreath and a knowing smirk, let's not forget he was a man on a mission, hell-bent on expanding Rome's reach while simultaneously securing his own legacy. Take the Gallic Wars, for instance. They weren't merely about adding a few more lines to Rome's borders. No, this was Caesar's way of stamping his authority, securing his political future, and ensuring that when people talked about the glory of Rome, his name was front and center. Consider the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC. Here's where Caesar pulled off a military maneuver so audacious, it made even his rivals begrudgingly tip their helmets. Surrounded by a numerically superior Gallic force led by Vercingetorix, Caesar built a double line of fortifications, one to keep the Gauls in, and another to keep any would-be rescuers out. It was like setting a trap within a trap, and it worked. Vercingetorix surrendered, and Caesar's political stock soared higher than a Roman aqueduct. But let's not romanticize it too much. For the soldiers on the ground, this wasn't about grand strategy. It was about keeping your head down and following orders while hoping you didn't end up as an unfortunate footnote in some historian's scroll. The siege was brutal, with men fighting not just the enemy, but starvation and disease. And if you thought the paycheck was bad, the punishment for failure or desertion was worse. Decimation, where 1 in 10 soldiers was executed for cowardice, was a real thing. It's the kind of team-building exercise that makes modern corporate retreats look like a day at the spa. And what about those campaigns in Britannia? Ah, the allure of the Misty Isles. You might think it was all about noble conquest, but in reality, it was as much about politics as it was about expansion. Caesar's expeditions in 55 and 54 BC were less about conquest and more about sending a message. Rome was watching, and they were ready to play hardball. Sure, they didn't conquer the island that would come later with Emperor Claudius, but the point was made. For the soldiers, it meant enduring a harsh climate that made them yearn for the sunny shores of the Mediterranean. Let's peel back the layers of the Roman military machine to understand the driving forces behind these campaigns. On the surface, it's easy to get swept up in tales of glory and empire building, but beneath it all, there was a very Roman pragmatism at work. Conquests were as much about economic gain as they were about political clout. New territories meant new resources, more taxes, and additional manpower to fuel Rome's insatiable appetite for growth. With each victory, the promise of loot dangled like a carrot in front of soldiers tired of military rations. Yet, like a cruel twist of fate, reality often fell short. Sure, there were moments when soldiers hit the jackpot, but more often than not, they ended up with less gold and more stories to tell their grandchildren. It's like expecting a bonus at work and getting a pat on the back instead. Now, let's debunk another myth, the idea that every Roman soldier was a willing participant in these conquests. The truth is, many were conscripted, swept up in the tides of Rome's relentless expansion machine. They fought not just for glory, but for survival, and in hopes of eventually seeing home again. Their stories, often overshadowed by the grandeur of the empire, remind us that behind every well-crafted strategy, there were real people with real fears and hopes. And speaking of strategy, Roman military tactics were a marvel of adaptability. The legions were like an ancient Swiss army knife, evolving to meet the challenges of different terrains and enemies. From the testudo formation, where soldiers formed a human tank with their shields, to the ingenious use of siege weapons, the Romans weren't just flexing their muscles. They were showcasing a strategic mind that was as sharp as a gladius. However, let's not kid ourselves into thinking it was all smooth sailing. The Roman army faced its share of blunders and hubris too. Remember the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC? Crassus, a member of the first triumvirate, led his men into a disastrous defeat against the Parthians. It was a classic case of underestimating the enemy and overestimating one's own prowess. The Parthians, with their superior cavalry tactics, ran circles around the Roman infantry, leading to a humiliating loss. For the soldiers caught in the midst of this debacle, it was a stark reminder that even the mighty Roman army was not invincible. Through all these campaigns, one thing remained constant, the harsh discipline that kept the legions in line. The Roman military was a well-oiled machine, but it relied on a strict code of conduct to function. Step out of line, and you'd be facing more than just a stern talking to. Think flogging, demotion, or worse. It was a system that valued order above all else, and it's what allowed Rome to project its power across vast distances, keeping provinces in check and enemies at bay. But discipline was a double-edged sword. It could forge a bond as strong as steel among soldiers, yet it could also breed resentment and fear. Desertion, while rare, was not unheard of, and for those who dared to flee, the consequences were dire. The Roman army didn't just let deserters vanish into the night. They pursued them with a tenacity that was terrifying, a stark warning to anyone thinking of abandoning their post. In the grand chessboard of Roman politics, soldiers were often pawns, moved and sacrificed to achieve the ambitions of their superiors. Yet they were also witnesses to history, the unsung participants in the rise and fall of emperors and generals. Their experiences, though shaped by the machinations of power, were deeply personal, filled with moments of camaraderie, hardship, and the occasional glimmer of glory. So, as we unravel the layers of political intrigue and military strategy that define the Roman soldier's life, we see a tapestry that is both complex and captivating. It's a story that challenges the myths of invincibility, revealing a more nuanced truth. The Roman army was not just a force of conquest. It was a reflection of human ambition and a testament to the resilience of those who served. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover as we continue to explore the lives of those who marched to the beat of Rome's mighty drum. But as we peel back the final layers of Roman military grandeur, we're left with the enduring legacy of these soldiers, a legacy as sprawling and complex as the empire itself. The Roman army didn't just conquer lands, it conquered the annals of history, leaving behind a footprint that still echoes today. Let's start by debunking the grandiose myth that Roman soldiers were invincible demigods of war. Sure, they were formidable, but the truth is, they were just as mortal and muddled as the rest of us. They faced not only external foes, but also the internal battles of discipline, survival, and the harsh realities of an empire perpetually hungry for more. The legions were less a band of superheroes and more a testament to human tenacity and adaptability. They evolved, learned, and often stumbled, just like any group thrown into the chaos of expansion and conquest. And yet, despite these gritty realities, the romanticized image of the Roman soldier persists. Why? Because let's face it, we all love a good hero story. The allure of the legionary, with his gleaming armor and steadfast resolve, taps into our cultural fascination with the stalwart defender, the noble warrior standing on the front lines of history. It's a story that has been told and retold, embellished at every turn, until the soldiers of Rome became larger-than-life figures striding through the pages of time. But the impact of these soldiers isn't just confined to history books or the occasional Hollywood epic. Their legacy resonates through modern military practices, too. Take the concept of disciplined formations and rigorous training. The Roman legions were pioneers in creating a structured military hierarchy where order and efficiency were paramount. This model influenced armies across Europe and beyond, from the disciplined ranks of medieval knights to the regimental structures of today's armed forces. The Roman emphasis on adaptability and strategy over sheer brute force is another lesson that echoes through time, reminding us that brains often trump brawn in the theater of war. Economically, the Roman military machine was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it fueled the economy through conquest, bringing in resources, slaves, and wealth to the heart of the empire. On the other hand, maintaining such a vast military presence was a colossal financial burden, one that eventually strained the coffers of Rome to breaking point. It's a reminder that while military might can expand borders, it can also stretch them too thin, a lesson as relevant today as it was back then. Politically, Roman soldiers were both the tools and the players of imperial ambitions. The army wasn't just a hammer to be wielded. It was a political entity unto itself, capable of toppling emperors and reshaping the Roman landscape. The Praetorian Guard, for instance, evolved from protectors of the emperor to kingmakers, wielding power that could make or break an imperial career. This intertwining of military and political power is a theme that reverberates through history, right up to the modern era, where the relationship between military and state remains a delicate balance. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Roman soldier is their role as a cultural touchstone. They are the quintessential symbol of the disciplined, stoic warrior, a figure that has been etched into the collective consciousness of Western civilization. Through the ages, Roman soldiers have been depicted in art, literature, and film, often as paragons of virtue or tragic heroes. Yet this romanticized version often glosses over the harsher truths, the exhaustion, the fear, the relentless march of duty that defined their existence. In wrapping up this exploration of Roman soldiers, let's not forget the human element at the core of the story. These were real people, with real lives, aspirations, and struggles. They were not just cogs in the imperial machine, but individuals who played their part in the grand narrative of Rome's rise and fall. Their legacy is a tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, victories and defeats woven together by the hands of time. As we close the chapter on the gritty, glorious, and sometimes grim world of the Roman soldier, let's carry forward the lessons of their lives. They remind us of the complexity of history, where myths and realities dance a delicate tango, each step revealing a bit more of the truth. They challenge us to look beyond the marble statues and epic tales to see the flesh and blood people who stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the unknown with nothing but their courage and camaraderie to guide them. So, the next time you find yourself captivated by stories of ancient Rome, remember the soldiers who walked those dusty roads, who fought those battles, and who, in their own way, shaped the world we live in today. They may have been ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, but their legacy is nothing short of monumental. And as you ponder their place in history, take a moment to appreciate the rich, layered tapestry of human experience they represent. One where the myth and the reality are as intertwined as the laurel wreaths that once crowned Rome's greatest triumphs. If you were alive in 1929, you'd probably be feeling like a rock star, without the guitar, but certainly with the swagger. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing, and life was all about jazz, flapper dresses, and most importantly, cash. Lots of it, or at least the illusion of it. Picture yourself sauntering down Fifth Avenue, the heart of New York's financial district, where the hum of prosperity was so loud it could drown out the sound of your tap shoes. Wall Street was the epicenter of this economic earthquake, where the stock market was not just a place for the elite, but a playground for anyone with a few bucks and a dream. Back in 1925, the market was valued at about $27 billion, but by 1929, it had more than tripled to $87 billion. Everyone and their grandma seemed to have a piece of the action. Stocks weren't just numbers on a ticker tape. They were the newest members of the family, often discussed over dinner like a gossipy aunt. But here's the kicker. Most folks weren't buying these stocks outright. Oh no, why use your own money when you could borrow it? Enter the concept of buying on margin. With just 10% down, you could own 100% of your stock. It's like buying a car by putting down the cost of the hubcaps and hoping you can pay off the rest before the repo man comes knocking. This era birthed some legendary financial figures. Jesse Livermore, the so-called boy plunger, was a celebrity in his own right, known for his ability to predict market trends with the kind of precision that made Nostradamus look like an amateur. Livermore's trades could shake the market, and he played the stock market like a grand piano. And then there was Charles E. Mitchell, head of National City Bank, who helped fuel the boom by marketing stocks like they were the latest fashion trend. He even offered loans for stock purchases. Talk about making it rain. Companies like RCA and General Motors were the darlings of the stock market, their shares climbing like ivy on a trellis. RCA's stock price skyrocketed from $85 in early 1928 to $420 by the summer of 1929. People believed the good times would roll indefinitely. Why wouldn't they? The Dow Jones Industrial Average had risen from 63 in 1921 to a peak of 381 in September 1929. It was like watching fireworks that never seemed to fade. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because like any good party, someone eventually has to clean up. The optimism that fueled the market was built on a foundation shakier than a Jenga tower at a toddler's birthday. The reality was that much of the economic prosperity was superficial. Productivity had increased, but wages hadn't kept pace. Farmers were struggling, drowning in debt from buying new machinery. And then there were the banks, which were about as stable as a unicyclist on a tightrope. Many were small and undercapitalized, making them vulnerable to any economic hiccup. You see, the stock market had become a national pastime, but it was more like a national obsession. Newspaper boys shouted the latest quotes, and tickers clattered in brokerage offices across the country. It was intoxicating and addictive, like the modern-day thrill of checking your cryptocurrency wallet. But here's the truth bomb. The market was a bubble, a big, shiny, beautiful bubble that was about to pop. In this giddy haze, few saw the storm brewing on the horizon. The warning signs were there, blinking like a neon sign in the fog. Economic growth was slowing, and consumer spending was dipping. The Federal Reserve, worried about the speculative bubble, raised interest rates. It was like trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose. But the public, fueled by tales of overnight millionaires, was deaf to caution. It was a time when speculation was king, and risk was just a four-letter word that nobody paid attention to. So there you were, living in a world where the American dream was on steroids. The market seemed like a magic money machine, and everyone was convinced they were just one good tip away from untold riches. But reality has a way of crashing the party, and as October 1929 approached, the music was about to stop. The question was, who would be left without a chair? You could feel it in the air, like the chill that creeps in before a thunderstorm. The optimism that had once fueled Wall Street's meteoric rise was beginning to curdle into something sour. October 24, 1929, dawned like any other Thursday, but by the time the sun set, it would forever be etched into history as Black Thursday. The day kicked off with chaos. The ticker tape, the heartbeat of Wall Street, was already lagging behind by nearly 2.5 hours. By 11 a.m., the market was in free fall, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeting by 11% in a single session. Picture a roller coaster that's lost its brakes, thrilling if you're watching from afar, but a nightmare if you're strapped in for the ride. Panic set in, as if someone had yelled, "Fire," in a crowded theater. Traders were racing around the floor like headless chickens, their faces etched with a cocktail of fear and disbelief. Everyone was selling, but nobody was buying. It was the financial equivalent of a stampede. Brokers were inundated with sell orders, telephones were ringing off the hook, and the sound of shouting traders created a cacophony that was almost musical in its madness. The price of RCA shares, the darling of the previous years, nosedived from $420 to $26. You could practically hear the sound of fortunes evaporating into thin air. Yet, amid this pandemonium, a group of bankers assembled in a desperate attempt to stem the tide. The meeting was convened by Thomas Lamont, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Co. Picture a gathering of financial titans in a smoke-filled room, clutching their cigars like lifelines. Lamont, along with Charles E. Mitchell of National City Bank, Albert Wiggin of Chase National, and Richard Whitney of the New York Stock Exchange, hatched a plan. These bankers collectively pledged $240 million, a staggering sum at the time, to buy stocks in a bid to stabilize the market. It was a bold move, a financial Hail Mary, if you will, akin to trying to plug a dam with a roll of duct tape. Richard Whitney, with the gravitas of a Hollywood star, walked onto the floor of the stock exchange and placed an order for 10,000 shares of U.S. Steel at $205 a share. It was a calculated gamble, a theatrical display meant to inspire confidence. For a moment, it worked. The market steadied, and the panic abated, if only temporarily. Whitney's actions were like a shot of adrenaline to a dying patient, offering a brief flicker of hope. But here's the rub. The damage was already done. The very fabric of trust had been shredded, and the psychological impact was profound. For those who lived through it, Black Thursday was a day of reckoning. People who had once viewed the stock market as a golden goose were now wary, their faith shaken to its core. As one trader lamented, it was as if the floor had dropped out from under us. The public, too, was swept up in the hysteria. Newspapers screamed headlines of financial ruin, and radio broadcasts painted a picture of economic Armageddon. This was not just a Wall Street problem. It was Main Street's nightmare, too. People who had never set foot in a brokerage office suddenly found themselves feeling the ripple effects. Savings evaporated, dreams crumbled, and the specter of poverty loomed large. It was as if the American dream had been put on hold, leaving a nation grappling with uncertainty. Yet, amidst this gloom, there remained a stubborn belief in the resilience of the market. After all, hadn't it always bounced back before? But this wasn't just another dip in the road. It was a sinkhole. The realization was slow to dawn, like a creeping shadow, but when it did, it was chilling in its clarity. The era of carefree speculation was over, and a new, harsher reality was setting in. As the sun dipped below the skyline of Manhattan, casting long shadows over the financial district, the question on everyone's mind was simple yet terrifying. What comes next? The answer would unfold in the days and months to follow, as the world grappled with the fallout of an unprecedented financial collapse. Black Thursday was just the beginning, a prelude to the economic turmoil that would define the decade. So, as you look back on that fateful day, remember it not just as a cautionary tale of greed and hubris, but as a stark reminder of the fragility of human optimism when faced with the cold, hard truths of economic reality. Just when you thought the market had found a stable footing, the stage was set for yet another act of financial drama, one that would make Black Thursday look like a dress rehearsal. In the aftermath of that tumultuous day, there was a collective sigh of relief as the market appeared to stabilize, thanks to those valiant efforts by our unsung heroes in tailored suits. But this sense of calm was more illusion than reality, like a magician's disappearing act where the rabbit is still in the hat, just out of sight. The weekend following Black Thursday was eerily quiet, a deceptive calm before the storm. Investors, still shaken, clung to the hope that the worst was over. Newspapers carried stories of the market's miraculous recovery, like a phoenix rising from its ashes. But beneath this veneer of optimism lay a cauldron of unresolved issues, bubbling ominously away. Now, let's talk about the myths that have aged like fine wine, or maybe like milk, depending on your perspective. The idea that the crash was inevitable because of some cosmic financial alignment is about as credible as horoscopes. Yes, there were warning signs. Economic growth was more sluggish than a Sunday driver in the fast lane, and consumer spending was having a midlife crisis. But inevitability, That's a big word, and it gives way too much credit to the notion of fate over human folly. One of the biggest blunders was the misguided belief in the market's invincibility, a kind of financial hubris that led to risky behaviors. The initial recovery post-Black Thursday was like giving a sugar rush to a diabetic patient, exciting but ultimately dangerous. Investors, buoyed by the temporary uptick, returned to their old habits of buying on margin as if nothing had changed. This wasn't just optimism, it was a full-scale denial of reality, the financial equivalent of ignoring a leaky roof during a rainstorm. Meanwhile, systemic issues lurked like alligators in the swamp, ready to snap. The banking system was a rickety contraption, with many banks over-leveraged and undercapitalized. It was a bit like trying to build a skyscraper on Jell-O. The Federal Reserve, in its infinite wisdom, had kept interest rates high, inadvertently strangling the economy while trying to curb speculation. It was like trying to put out a fire by blowing on it. Well-intentioned, sure, but ultimately ineffective. The political landscape didn't help either. This was an era when laissez-faire was more than just a fancy French term. It was a guiding principle. The government's hands-off approach to regulation made the Wild West look like a well-regulated theme park. The stock market was a free-for-all, with insider trading and market manipulation as common as flappers at a Gatsby party. As the weekend drew to a close, the world braced for what Monday would bring. Spoiler alert, it wasn't good. October 28, 1929, would become known as Black Monday, a day steeped in financial infamy. The market dropped another 13%, and the panic that had been temporarily abated came roaring back with a vengeance. It was as if someone had hit the reset button on chaos. The promise of stability unraveled faster than a cheap sweater. Investors who had been clinging to their portfolios like life rafts found themselves tossed into a sea of uncertainty. The specter of Black Tuesday loomed large, a grim reaper ready to deliver the final blow. And here's a kicker. While everyone was busy watching the roller coaster that was the stock market, underlying economic indicators were flashing red, like a Christmas tree in July. Consumer confidence was in free fall, and businesses were already feeling the pinch. The auto industry, a bellwether of the economy, reported declining sales as early as September. General Motors, one of the stock market's darlings, saw its stock price tumble from $73 to $8. That's not just a correction, that's a full-blown meltdown. Now, why does this matter? Because it highlights the disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street, a divide that would only grow wider as the Great Depression took hold. The stock market crash didn't just hurt investors, it was a body blow to the entire economy. Factories closed, jobs vanished, and the American dream began to resemble more of a nightmare. As Black Tuesday dawned, the sun cast long shadows over the financial district, a fitting metaphor for the long-term economic shadow that would follow. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted by another 12%, erasing billions of dollars in wealth in a single day. The market's decline was relentless, like a freight train barreling down a hill with no brakes. This wasn't just a financial crash, it was a psychological one. The trust that investors had placed in the market was shattered, like a mirror dropped from a great height. People were no longer just losing money, they were losing faith, and once that faith was gone, it was almost impossible to get back. So, as the dust settled and the reality of the situation began to sink in, the question wasn't just about what went wrong, but how to move forward. The crash of 1929 was a wake-up call, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked speculation and the fragility of economic prosperity. It was a lesson in the perils of greed, the folly of ignoring warning signs, and the importance of maintaining a safety net when walking the financial tightrope. In the days and weeks that followed, the full impact of the crash would become painfully clear. Unemployment soared, and breadlines became a common sight across the country. The echoes of Black Tuesday would reverberate for years, reshaping not just the financial landscape, but the very fabric of American society. And while the myth of the crash's inevitability is an alluring narrative, the reality is far more complex and cautionary. So, as we pause in this historical journey, remember that the crash of 1929 was not just a financial event. It was a profound turning point, a moment when the world was forced to confront the harsh realities of economic interdependence and the dangers of unchecked ambition. The story isn't over yet, so stay tuned as we delve deeper into the aftermath, and the lasting legacy of this pivotal period in history. And so, as the echoes of Black Tuesday began to ripple through the canyons of Wall Street, the city that never sleeps was wide awake with a collective sense of dread. It was October 29, 1929, and what was about to unfold would make the chaos of Black Monday look like a warm-up act. By the end of the day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average would plummet by another 12%, erasing a staggering $14 billion in market value. That's billion with a B, folks. Just to put that in perspective, adjusted for inflation, that's over $200 billion in today's dollars, evaporating in less time than it takes to make a decent pot of coffee. Inside the New York Stock Exchange, the scene was nothing short of pandemonium. Brokers shouted into telephones with voices hoarse from desperation, as ticker tapes spewed out numbers that seemed more like a cruel joke than financial reality. It was like being in the eye of a hurricane where chaos was the only constant. The floor was littered with scraps of paper, the remnants of sell orders that were piling up faster than the world's worst game of Jenga. And yet, for all the commotion, there was a strange silence in the air, a grim understanding that they were witnessing history being written in real time, and not the kind you'd want to feature in a highlight reel. Let's talk about the human toll for a moment, because behind every percentage point lost was a very real person with dashed hopes and dreams. Consider the story of Michael Meehan, a prominent Wall Street trader who, by all accounts, had the Midas touch. Meehan had been riding high on the bull market, playing the game with the kind of confidence that comes from thinking you're invincible. On Black Tuesday, he reportedly lost millions, a financial bloodbath that would leave him reeling. And Meehan wasn't alone. Thousands of traders found themselves in similar straits, their paper wealth vanishing into thin air like smoke from a snuffed-out candle. But it wasn't just the big traders who felt the sting. Everyday investors, people who had poured their life savings into the market, now faced financial ruin. Take Margaret Slattery, a schoolteacher from Ohio who had invested her modest savings in stocks, believing in the promise of prosperity. By the end of Black Tuesday, those savings were reduced to a fraction of their former value. Slattery's story was echoed across the nation, a painful reminder that the stock market's collapse was an equal opportunity destroyer, indiscriminately wrecking the lives of both the mighty and the modest. And here's where we debunk a bit of the myth, the idea that everyone was blindsided by the crash. While the sheer scale of the collapse was shocking, there were voices warning of impending doom. Economists like Irving Fisher had been bullish, famously declaring that stock prices had reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. But others, like Roger Babson, had been sounding the alarm about the bubble for months. Babson's warnings were met with skepticism and even ridicule, until, of course, he was proven right. Hindsight, as they say, is 20/20, but at the time, the notion that the market could sustain its meteoric rise was as intoxicating as it was delusional. As the dust began to settle, the immediate economic fallout became all too clear. Banks, already teetering on the edge, found themselves caught in a downward spiral. Many had invested heavily in the stock market, using depositor funds to fuel speculative activities. Now, with their investments decimated, they faced a liquidity crisis of epic proportions. Over the next few weeks, banks began to fail at an alarming rate, like dominoes in a chain reaction that showed no sign of stopping. Depositors, fearing the worst, rushed to withdraw their savings, only to find that the vaults were as empty as their hopes. It was a textbook run on the banks, a financial contagion that would spread like wildfire across the country. And then there was the impact on Main Street. Businesses, already feeling the pinch from declining consumer spending, were now faced with a bleak future. Orders dried up, inventories piled high, and layoffs became the order of the day. Unemployment, which had been a manageable 2% in 1929, began its relentless climb, eventually reaching a soul-crushing 25% by 1933. This wasn't just an economic downturn. It was a full-blown existential crisis for the American worker, a time when breadlines became the new normal and hope was in short supply. Yet, amidst this bleak backdrop, there were a few brave souls who looked for silver linings, believing that the market might eventually recover. Optimism, it seems, dies hard, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. People clung to the belief that the market was merely undergoing a correction, a temporary setback in the grand scheme of things. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, the harsh truth became undeniable. The Roaring Twenties had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, leaving in its wake a shattered economy and a demoralized populace. In the aftermath of Black Tuesday, the question on everyone's lips was a simple yet profound one. How could this happen? The answers were as complex as the forces that had driven the boom in the first place. Speculation, greed, and a lack of regulation all played their part in creating a perfect storm of financial ruin. But beyond the economics, there was a deeper lesson to be learned, a cautionary tale of hubris and the inevitable reckoning that follows when reality catches up with fantasy. As we pause here, remember that the story isn't over yet. The Great Depression would continue to unfold, reshaping not just the financial landscape, but the very fabric of American society. There would be new challenges to face, new lessons to learn, and eventually a path to recovery. But for now, as we stand on the precipice of history, it's worth reflecting on the fragility of our dreams and the resilience of the human spirit. Stay tuned, because the journey through this tumultuous period is far from finished. And so, as America stood on the precipice of a new decade, the echoes of Black Tuesday continued to resonate like a bad song stuck on repeat. The Great Depression didn't just knock on the door, it kicked it down, set up camp in the living room, and refused to leave. By 1930, what had been a financial panic had transformed into a full-blown economic disaster, the likes of which the world had never seen. The GDP shrank by nearly 30% between 1929 and 1933, and unemployment skyrocketed to a staggering 15 million people by 1933, roughly 25% of the workforce. Imagine 1 out of every 4 people you know being out of work, and you get a sense of the desperation in the air. But let's not just wallow in the misery of it all. Instead, let's talk about the silver linings, or at least the tin linings, because, in the rubble of financial ruin, there were important lessons and substantial changes that would reshape Wall Street and the broader economic landscape. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt, the charismatic figure who promised a new deal for the American people. With his election in 1932 came a slew of regulatory reforms aimed at reining in the rampant speculation and financial shenanigans that had brought the economy to its knees. One of the most significant changes was the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which separated commercial banking from investment banking. It was designed to prevent banks from using depositors' money for risky stock market gambles. Think of it as putting a child-proof lock on the financial cookie jar. And then there was the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, in 1934, tasked with regulating the stock market and protecting investors. For the first time, there was a watchdog in the financial henhouse, keeping an eye on those sneaky foxes. But before you start thinking this was a financial utopia, let's sprinkle in a little reality. These reforms, while vital, were far from perfect. The Glass-Steagall Act, for instance, was gradually eroded over the years, eventually being repealed in 1999. The SEC, though powerful, has always been a bit like a lifeguard at a crowded pool, necessary but sometimes overwhelmed by the sheer volume of activity. And let's not forget that human nature is a persistent little bugger. As long as there are markets, there will always be those who look at regulations as mere suggestions rather than rules. Now, onto the myth-busting. There's a persistent narrative that the Great Depression was solely caused by the stock market crash. But that's a bit like saying a house fire was caused by a single spark, ignoring the fact that the place was stuffed with kindling. The crash was the trigger, sure, but underlying economic weaknesses, like declining consumer demand and overproduction, were the tinder that allowed the fire to spread. And then there was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised tariffs on hundreds of imports and sparked a trade war. It was economic isolationism at its finest, an act of self-sabotage that only deepened the global downturn. The psychological impact of the Great Depression was profound, leaving a generation wary of the stock market. Trust, once shattered, was not easily rebuilt. It was a time when mattress stuffing became a popular alternative to bank deposits, and when the term bank run could cause cold sweats faster than a horror movie marathon. The Depression also sparked a wave of migration as people moved in search of work, leading to the iconic images of Archies traveling along Route 66. These weren't just folks with a penchant for road trips. They were families uprooted and desperate for a fresh start. But as the dust settled, a peculiar thing happened. The very system that had crumbled began to rebuild itself, albeit slowly and cautiously. The crash and subsequent depression underscored the cyclical nature of financial markets. What goes up must come down, and vice versa. It's like the world's most depressing roller coaster, where the thrill is always tempered by the inevitable descent. Yet, as much as we might like to think we've learned from history, the allure of speculative bubbles remains as tempting as ever. Just look at the dot-com bubble of the late 1990 or the housing bubble of the mid-2000s. The players change, but the game remains the same. So, what have we truly learned from the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression? For one, the importance of regulation can't be overstated. Unchecked financial markets are like toddlers with a box of matches, full of potential but prone to disaster. We've also learned the vital role of government intervention in stabilizing economies. FDR's New Deal was more than just alphabet soup. It was a lifeline for millions and a blueprint for future economic policy. And then there's the human element, the reminder that greed, fear, and the herd mentality are powerful forces in any market. As much as we'd like to think we're rational beings, the truth is we're often driven by emotion, chasing the next big thing, and then panicking when it all goes south. As we wrap up this historical journey, let's take a moment to reflect on the enduring legacy of those tumultuous years. The Great Depression was a period of immense hardship, but it also sparked innovation, reform, and a re-evaluation of what truly matters. It taught us the importance of a safety net, both financially and socially, and highlighted the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. And so, as you drift off to sleep tonight, let these lessons from the past be a comforting reminder that while history often repeats itself, it also evolves. We may stumble and fall, but we also learn to get back up, dust ourselves off, and try again. And isn't that the essence of the human experience? So, here's to the roller coaster of life. May we navigate it with a little more wisdom and a lot more humility. Sweet dreams, my friend. The Roman Circus Maximus wasn't just an arena. It was the heartbeat of an empire, the social media of its time with a live audience that could hit 250,000 on a good day. That's right, 250,000 people packed into one colossal stadium, and you're one of them, caught up in the electrifying chaos. You can almost taste the dust in the air, the roar of the crowd drowning out all other thoughts. This is the ultimate spectacle, a melodrama of speed and danger that makes modern NASCAR seem like a leisurely Sunday drive. The Charioteers, the rock stars of ancient Rome, are poised on the starting line, their horses snorting and stamping, eager for the off. This wasn't just a race, this was a cultural obsession. Romans didn't just watch chariot races, they lived them. They formed factions, wore team colors, and bet fortunes on their favorite charioteers. Sound familiar? It should. This is the ancient ancestor of your modern-day sports fandom. But while today's sports stars might worry about injuries that end careers, you as a Roman charioteer have a more pressing concern, staying alive. Because the truth is, this isn't just a race, it's a gamble with your life. Chariot racing was the fastest route to fame and fortune, but with a capital F for fatality. The average career for a charioteer was about as long as a mayfly's lifespan. The risks? Oh, just minor things like being trampled to death by your own horses or turning into a human missile if your chariot shattered. And yet the allure, the glory. Even Emperor Nero, that infamous patron of chaos, couldn't resist the call of the charioteer's life, albeit with a slightly less lethal safety net, thanks to his imperial status. Let's not sugarcoat it. The life of a charioteer was all glitter on the outside and gladiator-level grim on the inside. Take Scorpus, one of history's most celebrated charioteers. He racked up over 2,000 victories in his career, a number that seems as staggering as it was short-lived. Because by the age of 27, Scorpus was dead. Yeah, you heard that right, 27. Most people today are barely figuring out life, and this guy had already lived it to the fullest and paid the ultimate price. The Circus Maximus itself was a marvel of engineering, with its elongated track stretching over 600 meters. It had the turning radius of a Boeing 747 and those sharp turns at the end of the spine, or spina in Latin, claimed more than a few souls. The race was a spectacle of controlled chaos. 4 teams, reds, whites, blues, and greens, competed not just for victory, but for the adoration of the masses. And you, the charioteer, were both the hero and the sacrificial lamb. But why did the Romans love this so much? Well, consider the political climate. Bread and circuses weren't just a catchy phrase. They were a strategy. Keep the populace entertained, and they are less likely to revolt. Chariot races were a distraction, a chance for citizens of the empire to forget their troubles and revel in the adrenaline. It's the same reason people today flock to football stadiums or tune in to the Super Bowl, only with less bloodshed, usually. Historians tell us that these races could be as frequent as 10 to 12 times a year, with each event featuring as many as 24 races. That's a marathon of mayhem, enough to satisfy even the most bloodthirsty of fans. And the stakes? Colossal. A successful charioteer could earn a fortune in prize money and gifts, potentially pocketing up to 60,000 sesterces per race, a sum that could buy you a very nice villa and a comfortable retirement, provided you lived to see it. In a society that prized spectacle above all else, chariot races were the ultimate distraction. But beneath the veneer of glamour lay the grit and grime of a sport that was as cutthroat as it was captivating. So, while modern sports might have their own scandals and dramas, the life of a Roman charioteer was a reminder that sometimes glory comes at too high a price. And as you prepare to take your place in the starting gates, with the roar of the crowd echoing in your ears, you know that you're not just racing against your opponents, you're racing against fate itself. As the dust settles and the roar of the crowd echoes in your ears, it's time to face the cold, hard cash, or lack thereof, in the world of Roman chariot racing. Let's pull back the curtain on the economic reality of being a charioteer, which is about as glamorous as eating cold gruel out of a clay bowl. Sure, top racers like Scorpus could rake in enough sesterces to fill a small amphora, but for most, the dream of wealth was as elusive as catching a greased pig in a toga. First off, let's talk about the costs. Maintaining a chariot team wasn't just about keeping your horses fed and your wheels greased. Oh no, it was a financial black hole, sucking in every last sestus you could muster. The horses themselves were thoroughbreds, the ancient equivalent of owning a fleet of Ferraris. These magnificent beasts didn't come cheap. They were high-maintenance divas that required specialized diets, constant grooming, and the finest stables money could buy. And don't even get me started on the chariots, those sleek, lightweight vehicles of destruction that needed constant repairs and upgrades to keep them competitive. Think of it like owning a Formula One car, only with more horse manure. Now, for the lucky few who could afford to own their teams, the investment might pay off with a big win. But most charioteers weren't wealthy owners. They were skilled drivers, often slaves or freedmen, hired by wealthy patrons to race their teams. These athletes lived and died by the whims of their patrons, who could be as fickle as a Roman summer storm. If you weren't winning, you were out on your ear, or worse, back to a life of servitude. It was a high-stakes game where the deck was stacked against you, and the house always seemed to win. But why did they do it? Why risk life and limb for such uncertain rewards? Well, how about the intoxicating allure of fame and glory, the chance to be the toast of Rome, to have your name echo through the ages like a rock star of antiquity? And sure, there was prize money. A successful charioteer could earn up to 15,000 sesterces in a single race, a princely sum indeed. But here's the kicker. Only the very best got those fat purses. The rest, they were lucky to cover their expenses, let alone make a profit. The reality was that most charioteers scraped by, earning meager wages that barely kept the wolves from the door. Compare this to today's sports stars, who sign multi-million-dollar contracts and endorsement deals that make your head spin faster than a chariot wheel. In the world of Roman racing, economic disparity was the name of the game, and unless you were consistently winning, you might find yourself in the financial equivalent of a Roman bathhouse, steamy, crowded, and occasionally dangerous. Public perception, of course, was another matter entirely. To the adoring fans packing the Circus Maximus, charioteers were demigods, living legends who seemed to defy fate with every lap. The myth of the charioteer was a heady cocktail of bravado, skill, and a dash of insanity, but the reality was often one of debt, danger, and desperation. It was the ancient version of fake it till you make it, only with a lot more broken bones and fewer Instagram followers. And then there were the factions, the reds, whites, blues, and greens, each with their own fanatical following. These teams weren't just sports clubs. They were cultural institutions, wielding power and influence that extended far beyond the racetrack. Aligning with a faction could make or break a charioteer's career, offering support, resources, and the occasional bribe to keep the wheels turning. But like all things in the Roman world, loyalty was a slippery concept, and today's hero could become tomorrow's cautionary tale with the flick of a whip. So, as you stand there in the Circus Maximus, with the sun beating down and the crowd baying for blood, remember this. The life of a Roman charioteer was a high-wire act with no safety net. It was a world of dizzying highs and crushing lows, where triumph and tragedy were two sides of the same coin. And as you grip the reins, ready to race headlong into history, you know that the only certainty in this game is that nothing is certain at all. As you grip the reins, ready to race headlong into history, you know that the only certainty in this game is that nothing is certain at all. And speaking of uncertainty, let's dive into a world where allegiances shift faster than a chariot at full tilt. The tangled web of Roman politics. Welcome to the arena behind the arena, where charioteers were not just athletes, but chess pieces in the grand game of political power. In Rome, everything was political. Even the dust on the chariot track seemed to settle based on the whims of senators and emperors. Charioteers were at the mercy of these political currents, often finding themselves pawns in the hands of powerful factions. Let's talk about the blues and the greens, those infamous teams that were more than just a splash of color. They were political titans, wielding influence that could rival a modern political party. The blues traditionally drew support from the upper echelons of society, while the greens were more of the people's choice, the ancient equivalent of the underdog team with a surprising knack for upsetting the status quo. These factions weren't just about racing. They were deeply entrenched in the political and social fabric of Rome. Aligning with one faction over another was like choosing between chocolate or vanilla, only with a lot more potential for a stab in the back. For a charioteer, picking a side could make or break your career. A victory for the blues might earn you a pat on the back from a powerful senator, while a win for the greens could see you toasted by the masses. But it was a double-edged sword. Lose too often, and you'd be tossed aside like yesterday's toga. The political influence of these factions was staggering. They could sway public opinion, incite riots, and even, on occasion, influence decisions at the highest levels of government. Imagine a world where a sports team could topple a political leader. Sounds crazy, right? Yet, for Rome, this was just another day at the races. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian's reign, for example, was nearly undone by a riot, instigated by these very factions during the Nika riots of 532 AD. Not bad for a bunch of sports fans, huh? Charioteers themselves were often caught in the crossfire of these political games. They were celebrated like heroes, paraded through the streets after a victory, but their fates could change with the shifting winds of political favor. 1 minute, you're the darling of the blues, the next, you're yesterday's news, cast aside for the next big thing. It was like the worst reality TV show you could imagine, but with real stakes, your life and livelihood hanging in the balance. The patronage system further complicated matters. Charioteers were often under the thumb of wealthy patrons. Think of them as a mix between a modern sports manager and a mafia boss. These patrons funded the teams, paid for the best horses, and expected loyalty in return. Displease your patron, and you might find yourself back in the gutter, or worse, in a gladiator ring. A slight career pivot that no one was asking for. These patrons weren't just in it for the sport. They had political aspirations and used their charioteers as tools to curry favor with the right people. A win at the Circus Maximus could translate to political capital, a currency as valuable as gold in Rome. And let's be clear, these patrons weren't exactly altruists. They were in it for the power, prestige, and of course the money. It was capitalism with a side of chaos, where the rich got richer and the charioteers got, well, exploited. But it wasn't all bleak. For those who could navigate this treacherous landscape, the rewards were immense. Legendary charioteers like Gaius Apuleius Diarchus didn't just win races, they amassed fortunes. Diarchus reportedly earned 35. 8 million sesterces over his 24-year career, a sum that would make even today's top athletes envious. But remember, Diarchels was the exception, not the rule. For every Diarchels, there were countless others who never saw such success, their names lost to history, their lives a testament to the capricious nature of fortune. In this grand spectacle, charioteers were both celebrated and exploited, their careers as fleeting as a Roman summer. They lived on the knife's edge, their fates tied to the whims of patrons and the ever-shifting political landscape. Yet, despite the danger and the uncertainty, they remained the rock stars of their time, their exploits immortalized in the annals of history. So, as you prepare to take your place in the starting gates once more, remember this. In the world of Roman chariot racing, you're not just competing against your fellow racers. You're battling a system that sees you as both a hero and a pawn, a gladiator in a charioteer's tunic. And as the trumpets blare and the crowd roars, you know that out there on the track, anything can happen. Because in the Circus Maximus, the only thing more unpredictable than the race itself is the world that spins around it. So, as you're gearing up to face the track again, let's take a moment to appreciate the training regimen that molded you into the lean, mean, death-defying machine of the Roman chariot circuit. Picture this. Your average day starts at the crack of dawn, not with a leisurely breakfast of champions, but with the kind of grueling workout that would make a modern CrossFit enthusiast reconsider their life choices. We're talking about hours of driving practice, strength training, and those ever-essential reflex drills. Because when you're handling a chariot at breakneck speed, reaction time is the difference between taking home the laurels and being carted off to the nearest Roman equivalent of an emergency room. But let's not sugarcoat it. This was no cushy gym membership deal. You trained at the Ludus, a training school that was more gladiator camp than sports academy. Here, under the watchful eye of a Lannister, who was part coach, part drill sergeant, you'd be put through your paces. Your mornings likely involved practicing on a training track, honing your skills with a wooden chariot before graduating to the real deal. The Lannister wasn't there to give you pep talks. He was there to ensure you didn't embarrass your team, or more importantly, your patron. Fail to meet expectations, and you might find yourself demoted faster than you can say, Ave Caesar. And let's talk safety, or the glaring lack thereof. Forget helmets, padded gear, or even the comforting embrace of modern safety protocols. Your gear consisted of a leather helmet and a tunic, and if you were lucky, some basic padding. Charioteers often wrapped the reins around their bodies, a technique that offered better control, but also increased the risk of being dragged to an untimely demise. It was a constant gamble with fate, where a split-second decision could mean the difference between a victorious lap of honor and a very permanent dirt nap. The physical demands were relentless. You needed the upper body strength of a weightlifter to control the horses, the agility of a gymnast to navigate the chariot, and the nerves of a bomb disposal expert to keep it all together while hurtling around the Circus Maximus at speeds that would make a modern roller coaster blush. And remember, the track wasn't some pristine, manicured affair. It was a dusty, uneven, and occasionally treacherous expanse that could flip your chariot faster than a Roman senator could flip an allegiance. But why did these daredevils put themselves through it? Why risk life and limb for a sport that seemed more like a death wish than a career choice? The answer lies in the intoxicating allure of fame and glory. In ancient Rome, being a successful charioteer meant you were a household name, and not just in the "oh, isn't he that guy who races" way. We're talking about the kind of fame that could get your likeness on a fresco or your victories immortalized in verse. It was the ancient equivalent of trending on social media, with the added bonus of adoring fans throwing garlands instead of likes. Still, the harsh reality was that, for every charioteer who made it big, countless others faced a career that was, quite literally, a dead end. Consider the archaeological evidence. Mass graves of horses and charioteers unearthed around ancient racing sites tell a grim tale of the sport's toll. The bones don't lie. Fractures, crushed skulls, and other injuries paint a vivid picture of the risks involved. It's a sobering reminder that for every race won, there were many more that ended in tragedy. Yet despite these dangers, the myth of the fearless charioteer endured. They were the rock stars of their time, immortalized in mosaics and celebrated in graffiti. The romantic image of the dashing driver, reins in hand, thundering down the track, was a potent symbol of Roman bravado. But peel back the layers, and you find a world where glamour and grit were inseparable, where the quest for glory came with a hefty serving of jeopardy. What about the spectators, those throngs of Romans who flocked to the Circus Maximus to witness this spectacle of speed and skill? They were as much a part of the sport as the charioteers themselves. Fans weren't just passive observers. They were a vibrant, vocal force, capable of turning the tide of a race with their cheers or jeers. And for some, the races were more than mere entertainment. They were a chance to participate in the high-stakes game of betting, where fortunes could be won or lost with a single, heart-stopping lap around the track. The parallels with modern extreme sports are hard to ignore. Just like today's daredevils who leap from planes or race motorcycles at breakneck speeds, Roman charioteers shared a similar disregard for safety in pursuit of that adrenaline rush. The difference: today's thrill-seekers have the benefit of advanced safety gear, emergency medical teams, and a hefty insurance policy. Back then, it was just you, your horses, and the capricious hand of destiny. But let's not forget, these charioteers were also entertainers, and the races were as much about the show as the competition. The Circus Maximus wasn't just a venue. It was a stage where drama, danger, and spectacle played out in front of tens of thousands. The charioteers were the protagonists of this grand narrative, their lives a testament to the human spirit's drive to push boundaries, even when those boundaries were lined with peril. So, as you stand there, chariot at the ready, the roar of the crowd echoing in your ears, consider the legacy you're a part of. You're not just competing for a corner of history. You're living out a story that has captivated imaginations for centuries. But remember, in the world of Roman chariot racing, the line between legend and oblivion is as thin as the wheels beneath your feet. And as the trumpets sound, signaling the start of yet another race, you know that out there on the track, the stakes have never been higher. And here you are, poised at the edge of history, ready to launch into the annals of time, or crash out in a blaze of ignominy. But as the dust settles on our tale of Roman charioteers, let's pull the reins a bit and take a look at how these daredevils have revved their way into our collective imagination over the centuries. First off, let's tackle the myth-making machine that is human memory. Charioteers have been painted in the romantic hues of legend, their lives morphed into tales of dashing heroes who defied odds and gravity with the same nonchalance. The truth is, these guys were more like the evil Nevils of antiquity than the suave James Barnes. They were risk-takers, sure, but their world was more about grit than glamour. Their legacy, a testament to human fascination with those who flirt with danger and occasionally make it home for dinner. Consider the enduring appeal of these ancient speed demons. From the pages of Ben-Hur to the countless modern sports stars who channel their spirit, the charioteer archetype is deeply ingrained in our culture. Movies, books, video games, every medium has had a go at capturing the thrill and peril of the Roman races. But why do they resonate so deeply with us? Perhaps it's the intoxicating mix of skill and sheer audacity, the human drama played out in microseconds, or the tantalizing promise of glory or oblivion just around the corner. But let's not get too swept up in the romance. The reality was, as always, less poetic. For every charioteer who became a household name, there were many more who crashed, burned, and vanished into obscurity. The Romans sure loved their spectacles, but behind every thundering race was the cold calculation of survival. The Circus Maximus was both a stage and a battlefield, where the cost of failure was more than just bruised pride. It was often fatal. And yet, like moths to a flame, the charioteers raced on, driven by the same forces that propel modern athletes: ambition, the dream of transcendence, and, let's be honest, a touch of insanity. Economically, the stakes were as high as the risks. The financial reality of being a charioteer was as precarious as balancing on the edge of a knife. Sure, the top performers like Gaius Appuleius Diocles raked in fortunes that would make a modern hedge fund manager blush. But for the rest, the dream of wealth was as slippery as the rains in a rainstorm. The top prize of 15,000 sesterces per race was tantalizing. But remember, only a fraction ever saw such riches. The rest were left scrambling for scraps, their lives a cycle of debt and danger, with the odds stacked higher than an emperor's ego. Politically, these races were a microcosm of Roman society, an intersection where sport met spectacle met statecraft. The blues and greens were more than just teams. They were political entities with real clout. Imagine a sports league today that could sway elections or topple governments. Sounds far-fetched. Not in Rome. These factions wielded influence like a chef wields a cleaver, with just as much precision and potential for chaos. The Charioteers themselves were pawns in this game, celebrated and discarded at the whims of political winds. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of these harsh realities, the legacy of the Charioteer endures. They symbolize the eternal human saga, striving against odds, the allure of fame, the thrill of the chase. Their stories remind us of the cost of glory, the thin line between hero and martyr. In a world that's constantly changing, the Charioteer's tale is a constant, a reflection of our own desires, and the price we're willing to pay to achieve them. So, what can we learn from these ancient speedsters? Maybe it's the lesson that the pursuit of greatness is as fraught with peril as it is with promise, or that the line between success and catastrophe is as thin as a chariot's wheel. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is this. In the end, it's not just about winning the race, but daring to run it in the first place. As you close the book on this chapter of history, remember the Charioteers not just as thrill-seekers, but as poignant reminders of the human condition. They raced not just for themselves, but for the spectacle, for the chance to touch the divine in the brief moments between the starting signal and the finish line. And as the echoes of the Circus Maximus fade into the distance, their legacy remains a vivid part of our cultural tapestry, a tribute to those who dared to live and sometimes die on the edge.